Tonight, we will sit together in an ancient tea house in China, a place where time ceases to hurry and where wisps of steam from the teapot curl upwards like silent thoughts in the mind. Outside, the night drapes a soft, indigo hue over the curved roof tiles, and the night breeze glides gently through the bamboo grove behind the garden, as if breathing softly along with you. The scent of damp earth, the fragrance of fresh tea leaves, and the quiet crackle of the boiling water become the soundtrack for the inner journey you are about to embark on. In this space, an old monk, cloaked in a coarse, ash-brown robe, silently bows to pour the tea. There are no long sermons, no bells or gongs, only the steam, the breath, and this present moment. The world you are entering does not need you to understand it all at once. It only asks you to be present. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, share your current location and time in the comments below. We might be sipping tea together from very different time zones. Now, dim the lights for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the ancient city of Suzhou, where canals snake around curved roof houses and red lanterns reflect on the water's surface, there is a tea house tucked away behind the weeping willows. The locals call it the 10-breath tea house, because the old monk there serves exactly 10 pots of tea each day. No more, no less. And when the 10th pot is empty, he closes the door, even if a long line of people is still waiting outside. That afternoon, as the last rays of sunlight retreated from the mossy green tiles, you arrived just as the old monk was brewing the 8th pot. You didn't come as a spiritual seeker, nor as a pilgrim. You came because you were tired, because you were thirsty, because you needed a place to sit, a cup of hot tea, and a moment of peace amid a life that had been swirling like a nameless vortex. You opened the old wooden door, and the wind chime, hanging above, tinkled like a soft cough of time. Inside the tea house, there were only 3 people: the old monk, a middle-aged woman meditating with her hands clasped by the window, and an empty chair placed opposite him. He didn't ask your name. He didn't ask where you came from. He simply bowed his head slightly, pouring boiling water into a brown ceramic pot with a chipped corner on its handle. He looked at you as if he had shared this very tea table with you in some distant, forgotten lifetime. "Sit," he said, not with his mouth, but with a small nod that was enough to make you drop your backpack and settle into the chair, as if everything here had been waiting for you. The tea was poured, the steam rose, rolling over the lip of the cup, as light as a thought not yet formed. He didn't ask if you were thirsty. You didn't need to answer. At that moment, tea was no longer a beverage. It was an invitation, a very gentle one, into a single moment, the present. You smelled the scent of jasmine, faint, like a memory of a summer afternoon that had long since dissolved into the wind. Then the scent vanished, like everything else, just as the sorrow you carried with you began to dissolve, piece by piece. Outside, a cat meowed softly, perhaps playing with its own shadow under a lantern. Inside the tea house, everything seemed to be melting into one another: light, sound, time, and you. That was when he began to tell a story, not to preach, but to pour out, like tea. Lessons that needed no words. You sat there, amidst the aroma of tea and the warm steam, in a space that seemed to be held together by the very rhythm of the tea master's breath. Each of his movements, tilting the pot, turning his wrist, lifting the cup, had its own cadence, as if time only existed within those small gestures, not rushed, not slow, just in sync with the present. The old monk didn't look at you or ask any questions, but you felt as if he knew everything you hadn't said. The unformed questions, the worries folded away at the bottom of your heart. He didn't need the details. He just poured more hot water and let the steam speak for him. "A man once came here," he began, his voice as dry as an earthen wall baked by 100 seasons of sun, "and sat right where you are sitting." You nodded, holding your cup steady. He didn't need your agreement, but it was your way of saying you were listening. "He traveled to many places." The monk continued, seeking masters, seeking spiritual paths, seeking peace. But the more he traveled, the more his heart was in turmoil, the more his mind was scattered. His gaze drifted past the steam as it dissolved into the air, like a small life evaporating. Then, one day, he came here, just like you, carrying nothing but an invisible weight on his shoulders. I just poured tea. I didn't ask, didn't lecture. After 3 cups, he wept. You weren't surprised. The story resembled your own, more than you wanted to admit. In the deepest part of us, doesn't everyone carry a wordless exhaustion, a formless burden? The old monk didn't need you to answer. He just poured more. "Do you know why a teacup is round?" he asked, lifting a cup and gently turning it to catch the light from the oil lamp. You shook your head. "Because it has no corners. It doesn't cling. It holds nothing back. When tea is poured in, it receives. When it's empty, it lets go. And when it is empty, it can receive again." You looked down at your own cup. The steam was still rising, forming a small, lingering cloud. The round cup was like a beautiful emptiness, a space where everything could pass through without leaving a trace. He nodded slightly, as if he saw that you understood, not with your intellect, but with a feeling like the warmth of the tea that had just passed down your throat. A wordless comfort. You asked, like a soft echo, "What if I can't be empty?" He smiled. Not a big smile, just a small movement at the corner of his eyes, a gentle crinkle. Then just be aware of that. The awareness itself is the beginning of letting go. Outside, the rain began to fall. The sound of it on the roof tiles was like someone scattering seeds into the vastness of space. The tea house seemed to sink deeper into a new layer of silence, where the sound of the rain and the sound of your heart blended into one. The old monk stood up and walked slowly to the door. He didn't open it, just looked through a thin wooden crack. "The rain is like our troubles," he said. "When we don't try to avoid it, we can hear its beautiful music." You remained silent, then looked at your cup again. There was still a little tea left. You brought it to your lips and took the last sip. The tea had cooled, but something inside you had just warmed up. He turned back, and as if seeing the question in your eyes, he continued, "Each sip of tea is a moment. If we drink it while our mind is elsewhere, that sip is wasted. But if we are fully present, then even a sip of plain water becomes a spiritual practice." You heard that sentence clearly, like a wisp of smoke that had drifted by and etched itself onto the walls of your mind. He wasn't preaching, just telling, like pouring tea, like placing each idea into a small cup, then letting you drink it with your own heart. You asked softly, not knowing why, "So that man, the one who sat here and cried, did he finally find peace?" The monk looked at you for a moment, then smiled. "I don't know, but I know that after that day, he learned how to pour tea for others. You asked no more questions. The answer was enough for tonight, when you needed no other reason to sit still and simply listen to the rain. The tea was cold now, but you were in no hurry. In that coolness, there was something you wanted to hold on your tongue for a long time, not for the taste, but for the feeling of being still. The old monk said no more. He just continued to pour boiling water into the pot, his hand maintaining a rhythm like breathing. The soft crackling from the small charcoal stove in the corner sounded like whispers from a bygone era. You heard the gurgling of boiling water, the popping of burning wood, and the silence that was filling the space. Each sound had its place, not competing, not pushing. He set the teapot down and took out another small cup. This time, it was a white porcelain cup with a crack running from the rim to the base. He looked at it for a long time before placing it in front of you. "Do you see this crack?" he asked, as if you could possibly miss it. You nodded. "Some would say to throw it away because the water will leak, but I still use it because this crack reminds me even that which is not perfect can still serve." You looked closer. The crack was indeed small, but enough to show that the cup had once been dropped, perhaps in a moment of carelessness, perhaps while cleaning in a hurry, but it was still here, still being filled with tea, still holding warmth for a moment. "People are the same," he continued, his voice like morning mist. "Everyone has a crack somewhere. It might be a painful memory, a youthful mistake, a scar never spoken of, but it is those very cracks that teach a person how to truly keep others warm." You instinctively touched your wrist, where a small, long-healed scratch remained. Maybe he was right. We don't truly know how to love until we have known pain. "Someone once brought this cup here," he went on, intending to trade it for a new one. But I disagreed. I just poured tea into it, handed it back to him, and said, "Try it." After that, he fell silent, and has kept it to this day. You smiled softly, not because the story was funny, but because a sense of gratitude was spreading through you. Gratitude for a place like this. Gratitude for a man like him, and gratitude for living slowly enough to hear this. The old monk stood up again, this time retrieving a small cloth bag from behind him. Inside were dried tea leaves, carefully wrapped in rice paper. He opened it, and a gentle, sweet aroma filled the air, reminding you of a place not in your memory, yet deeply familiar. "This is ox yoke tea," he said, "a tea few people drink because its first sip is very bitter. But if you are patient, the aftertaste is as gentle as dew." You nodded, not because you understood, but because you wanted to experience it. He brewed the new tea. The water was darker. The scent was slightly sharp, like damp earth after a rain. You took a sip. It was indeed bitter, so bitter it stunned you into silence. But immediately after, a thin veil of sweetness washed over your palate like a stream seeping through stone. "Just like suffering," he said. "It is a gateway, not a destination. If we are patient enough not to turn away at the first sip, we will realize the sweetness is not far away. It was always there, just hidden by the first layer." You closed your eyes, listening to the warmth spread down your spine, and unconsciously, you thought of the hardships you had faced. Were they also the first sips had you turned away too soon, never tasting the gentle sweetness that followed outside? The rain continued to fall, not hard, not soft, just steady drops, like consciousness returning to each breath. "A long time ago," he added, "I used to fear the rain, because every time it rained, the roof would leak, clothes got wet. The pillow and mat were cold, but one day, I stopped fighting it. I just placed a basin under the leak and went to sleep with the sound of the rain as my lullaby. You looked at him, your eyes wide. In that moment, he was not just an old monk in a tea house. He was the embodiment of acceptance, of tranquility, of someone who had stopped resisting the inevitable. And do you know what he smiled gently that night? I slept better than any night before. You bowed your head, not to thank him, but as if bowing before something greater than reason, an understanding that came not from the mind, but from the very bottom of your soul. You began to see more clearly in this tea house. Every action was a living verse, needing no scripture, only to be felt. The old monk didn't need to preach, because his every gesture, from pouring water to lifting a cup, was a vivid expression of mindfulness. He sat down, using his hand to brush away a silver hair that had fallen into the tea, not for hygiene, but out of respect for every drop of water, every tea leaf. Perhaps for him, every atom deserved attention. You asked, your voice so soft, you feared it might break the silence, Master. How can tea make my heart feel so light? He didn't answer right away. He poured more water. Then he said gently, because tea is not in a hurry. You furrowed your brow, thinking you had misheard. He continued, his lips slightly curved as if in a smile. Tea is not rushed like people are. It doesn't boil just to get the job done. It doesn't force its leaves to open quickly. It just does its work under the right conditions, water hot enough, time long enough, a mind still enough. And in doing so, it teaches us how to live. You looked down at the cup in your hand. The tea leaves had settled at the bottom, like a dream that had just dissolved. No one told the leaves to stop there. They knew their own timing. They knew how to let go. You nodded slowly, whispering, I didn't know I needed to learn that until I sat here. The old monk said nothing. He simply reached for a cloth from his sleeve and wiped the rim of the cup. A gesture repeated for 1,000 days before. People often ask me, Master, what have you awakened to? He said slowly. I reply, I no longer need to awaken to anything. You raised an eyebrow, waiting for an explanation, but he didn't continue. He just placed his hand on the table, lightly touching the scratched wood. You understood. Sometimes, letting go of the need to understand is the deepest understanding of all. He poured more water into the pot. This time, there was no sound, only steam. It rose, swirling like vague thoughts that appeared and vanished at once. Then he told another story. When I was a young novice, I used to hate washing dishes. Every day, I had to wash for the entire community. My hands were wrinkled. The water was cold. The grease clung relentlessly. I did it just to get it over with no mindfulness. You smiled, seeing a reflection of yourself in his words. Until one day, my teacher came over. He wasn't angry, didn't scold me. He just said, if you wash the dishes just to be done with them, then your whole life will be spent passing through things like a shadow. But if you wash the dishes just to wash the dishes, you will begin to live. You exhaled very slowly, not because the saying was profound, but because it was so close, so true. How many things in your life had you done just to be done with them? The old monk lifted the teapot, not to pour, but to look at it. From that day on, he said, I began to wash dishes as if I were brewing tea, and brew tea as if I were washing dishes. No task was higher, no action was lower. You felt your heart soften, like a string on an instrument being tuned to the right key. The rain outside the eaves seemed to change its rhythm, from scattered drops to a steady beat, like the sound of a monastery gong. You imagined the rain was the sound of your heart, falling drop by drop onto the still surface of the present. The old monk looked outside. "Do you hear anything?" You listened, trying hard. He shook his head gently. "Don't try. Just leave your ears open, and everything will enter on its own." A minute passed, maybe two. No one spoke. No one needed to. You began to hear the sound of the wind brushing against the roof, the faint rustle of trees, the sound of the breeze slipping through the wooden door. And deep within, you heard the sound of yourself, not a voice, but the feeling of being present, being alive, being here. "That is meditation," he said. "Not sitting cross-legged, not needing to close your eyes, just letting go of distinctions. Everything else will reveal itself." You closed your eyes, this time not to escape the world, but to touch it more clearly. And in that moment, you knew tonight was not an ordinary night. This was the night you learned to drink tea with your whole heart. The tea's flavor had faded, but your heart felt fuller than ever. It was as if each sip you took was another layer of clouds being quietly lifted from your mind. No analysis needed, no theory to understand. Just be present. Just breathe with the tea. The old monk stood up and slowly took an old ceramic pot from a shelf. It was unlike the others in the tea house. Its color was dark, like earth after rain. Its handle was half chipped. The lid was slightly warped. He placed it before you, as if entrusting you with a secret meant only for one who was still enough. "This pot," he said, "was once broken into 3 pieces." You were surprised. It looked whole, though there were a few faint lines. He nodded, touching the body of the pot gently. "I didn't throw it away. I just used tree sap, red clay, and time to mend it. Every day, I still use it to brew tea. As a reminder, everything can heal if we don't try to force it back to how it was before." You looked closely. The cracks were visible, but they didn't weaken the pot. On the contrary, they gave it a somber beauty, the beauty of something that had been broken, that had known pain, yet continued to exist, to serve, to share. "Someone once asked me," he continued, "why I didn't use a better glue, one that would hide the cracks." He shook his head. "Because I don't want to hide them. A wound, if acknowledged and cared for, becomes a part of its beauty. But if you keep trying to cover it up, it will only fester inside." You didn't know when your breathing had become lighter. Perhaps it was from the moment you realized that your own cracks could also be places where the light gets in. The old monk poured hot water into that very pot. The water overflowed, spilling onto the small saucer beneath, creating a trickling sound like a stream flowing through a forest. "Before," he said, "I wanted to be a perfect person. No anger, no mistakes, no cracks. But then I realized such a person only exists in ideas, not in tea houses, not in life." He smiled, placing a hand on his chest. "And that idea was more tiring than any flaw I ever carried." You nodded, your heart letting go of something, not because you were forgiven, but because you knew you didn't need to ask for forgiveness from the world, only to live honestly with yourself, with what was whole, and with what was broken. Outside, the rain had softened. Only a few sparse drops remained, falling like a heart being wiped clean. You asked, "Master, are you ever afraid of being lonely, staying here all by yourself?" He was silent, so long that you thought he hadn't heard you. But then he answered, his eyes still fixed on the tea leaves steeping in the pot. Loneliness is when you are looking for someone else. But here, I don't need to go anywhere. I am not missing anyone. I am not waiting for anyone. I am not lonely because I am with this moment. You listened, as if drinking a tea whose name you had never known. A very strange flavor. Not sweet, not bitter, not sour, but deep. "And what about you?" he asked in return, his eyes on you. You didn't answer, but your heart knew. It knew that the loneliness that had clung to you probably didn't come from a lack of people around you, but from the fact that you had never truly been with yourself. At that moment, he handed you a small piece of paper, rolled up and tied with a red thread. "This is from a guest who left it behind. I've kept it for many years, but today, I think it belongs to you." You opened it. On the paper were only 3 words, written in faded brown ink: "Just stay here." 3 words, nothing more. No sender's name, no explanation. You looked at him, your eyes questioning. He simply nodded. That phrase, "I think," is for the present moment. When your mind wants to run, when your thoughts want to worry, when your heart wants to hide, remember, just stay here. You looked out the door. The first light after the rain was illuminating the courtyard. Water droplets clung to the leaves, glistening like unwritten verses. Birds were chirping timidly. The space grew brighter, without the sun having fully risen. You understood. The night doesn't pass just because the clock ticks. It passes because the heart has calmed down. You place the paper in your palm, folding it carefully. At that moment, the tea in the pot had steeped just right. He poured it out, the first cup for you. You lifted the cup, your hand no longer trembling as it had when you first arrived. That sip of tea was unlike any before it, not because it was more delicious, but because this time you were truly present. This time, the steam didn't hurry away. It lingered, like a contemplative wisp of smoke, unwilling to dissolve into the air. You let the cup touch your lips, not rushing to drink, as if just smelling it was enough to warm your soul. The old monk said no more. He looked up at the wooden rafters where a coil of rope hung, tied in a simple loop. It wasn't frightening, held no hint of death, but was like a circular frame, a reminder of the interconnectedness of all things. You followed his gaze, then asked softly, "What does that circle mean, Master?" He smiled, his eyes still on the rope. "The ancients called it no beginning, no end. Just like you, like your mind. It comes from nowhere and goes nowhere. There is only the present." You nodded, not because you understood it all, but because your heart believed his words were true. There was something about that circle that made you feel light, as if you no longer needed to rush out to find something else. "When I was young," he said, "I used to fear losing everything, feared being left behind, feared being forgotten. But the more I tried to hold on, the emptier I felt. Then one day, I began to learn how to be empty. Not empty in a void, but empty of clinging, of holding, of stuffing things inside." He placed his hand on the now empty teapot, as if to feel how the emptiness at its bottom was also part of brewing tea. Without emptiness, there is no space to receive. "Do you know what the hardest part of brewing tea is?" he asked. You raised an eyebrow. "It's not choosing the tea, not watching the fire. It's knowing when to stop pouring." You were taken aback. "Stop pouring?" "Yes, because if you keep pouring when the cup is full, the tea will spill. It's hot, it burns. You lose the best part. But if you stop at the right time, the tea left in the pot will continue to steep, enriching the next brew. Life is like that too. Knowing when to stop that is wisdom. You smiled softly. How many times had you overpoured in relationships, in expectations, in your search for something? You took the last sip from your cup, feeling the warmth seep into your fingertips. Unconsciously, you asked, "Master, have you ever felt you missed out on something, a person, a place, a choice?" The old monk grew pensive. His face, in that moment, was not that of an old man accustomed to tranquility, but the face of someone who had once had desires, who had once waited. "Of course," he said, very honestly, "there was someone I loved very much, long ago, but the path of spiritual practice and the path of worldly life do not always run parallel. I chose to turn, and I never saw her again. You were silent, but then I understood." He continued, "She was not lost. She became a part of every bowl of tea I brew, in every word I do not speak, in every unfulfilled dream, not lost, just transformed." You placed your hand on the table, feeling the cool, rough grain of the wood, a kind of truth that didn't need to be written down, only to be felt in stillness. Outside, the early morning sun had begun to filter through the leaves. The last raindrops clung to the tips of the bamboo, sparkling like words left unspoken. The old monk looked out. "Every morning, I sit here, brew a pot of tea, and watch the sunlight pierce through the steam. Not to remember, but to remind myself, whether people come or go, the tea must still be brewed." You looked at him, filled with admiration, not because he was enlightened, but because he dared to stay with the things that were not whole. He stood up, took out a new type of tea, this one very fragrant, its leaves as green as a spring bud. He rinsed them, then carefully poured them into a separate cup, placing it before you. "This cup," he said, "is not for drinking. It is only for smelling, and for remembering that there are things we do not need to possess to be able to feel." You brought the cup to your nose and closed your eyes. The fragrance was as delicate as the first breeze of the season. Not sweet, not astringent, just a real scent, nothing more, nothing less. And in that moment, you knew you would remember this cup of tea for the rest of your life, though you had never drunk it. A lesson without words, without books, only an undrunk cup of tea and a heart that was already full. The cup before you remained full, but you didn't need to drink it to feel your heart warm. The fragrance continued to spread gently, like an invitation without pressure to live with what is, even if you haven't touched it. The old monk sat opposite you, his hands resting on his knees, in a posture that suggested he could sit perfectly still for hours. His gaze was no longer on the courtyard, but was quietly resting on you, not scrutinizing, not questioning, just being present. And in that presence, you felt completely accepted. "I once had a teacher," he began, "who, whenever I asked him something, would just look at me without speaking. At first, I thought he hadn't heard me. Later, I understood he was giving me the chance to answer myself." You remained silent. The words you had just heard didn't demand an intellectual response. They only asked for absorption, like water slowly seeping into the earth. "One time," he continued, "I asked my teacher, 'Why does my mind always feel like a lake full of waves?' He didn't answer. He just handed me a mirror and said, 'Look.' You tilted your head slightly. 'A mirror.' He nodded. In the mirror, I saw my face. Then my teacher's reflection behind me. Then the sky and clouds outside the window. Finally, I realized the mirror does nothing. It only reflects. But if the surface is covered in dust, You see nothing. You looked down at your own palm, as if searching for an invisible mirror within it. My teacher said, "The mind is the same. It doesn't need to be fixed or taught. It just needs to be wiped clean. Don't try to force it to be still. Let it reflect itself." You suddenly understood why, sitting in this tea house, you saw yourself more clearly than anywhere else. Not because it was special, but because here, no one was forcing you to be anyone else. The old monk took out a small wooden box. Inside were pebbles of various colors: red, white, black, brown, and pale green. He poured them onto the table, arranging them in a circle. "Each of these stones," he said, "was collected from places I have been. One is from Clearwater Stream, where I used to meditate by the bank. One is from the fields of Linan, where I once buried a small bird that died in the rain. Another is from the old temple, where my teacher passed away." You looked at them. None of the stones were special, none were precious, but arranged in a circle, they had a strange beauty, rustic, humble, and evocative. "Every place I have been," he said, "has left a part of itself in me. And I have left a part of myself there, but eventually I gathered them, not to keep them, but to remember everything that was once a part, however scattered, can return and form a complete whole." You felt that very clearly. The scattered pieces of your own life, the relationships that had ended, the plans that had failed, the dreams that had broken, they weren't lost. They were just waiting for you to gather them, to arrange them into your own circle. He handed you an ivory white pebble, as smooth as the new moon. "Keep this," he said. "You don't need to do anything with it. Just when your mind feels lost, hold it, place it in your hand, and remember, you were once truly, fully present. Here." You took it. The pebble was small, cool, but nestled in your palm, it seemed to carry the warmth of this tea house. "Don't be quick to treat it as a souvenir," he advised. "Let it become a part of you, like the final taste of tea, no longer in your mouth, but forever in your heart." You looked outside. The sky was now bright. Sunlight glistened on the mossy roof tiles. On the steps, a calico cat was sleeping, its belly rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. It slept so peacefully, as if the whole world had nothing left to worry about. The old monk looked at you and said softly, "Do you know the difference between a cat and a human?" You shook your head. A cat doesn't need a reason to be still, but humans are always looking for a reason to be allowed to be still. That is the difference, and also the suffering. You smiled. Not the smile of someone who had just understood something new, but the smile of someone who had just set down an invisible burden he didn't realize he was carrying. You asked no more questions. At this point, silence was enough. The early morning light had now reached every corner of the tea house, touching each dust mote, dancing in the air like mist. You realized you had been sitting for an entire night. No phone, no clock, no plans, only tea, rain, and small stories like drops of water, and you had never felt time pass so gently. The old monk made no mention of time. It seemed that for him, night and day were just two different shades of the same breath. He stood up, took a straw broom from the corner, and began to sweep the wooden floor lightly. Each of his steps made a soft, rhythmic sound, like a verse being chanted with his feet. You watched him without saying a word. A part of you wanted to help, but a deeper part knew that some things are meant to be watched, not interrupted. For him, sweeping the floor was meditation. It was a ritual. It was a word of thanks to the morning. "Do you know why I sweep the floor every morning?" he asked, as the sunlight touched the hem of his robe. "You guessed. Because of the dust." He nodded, but then shook his head. "The dust is just a manifestation. The thing that needs sweeping is not the dust. It's the mind that has gathered dust." You furrowed your brow. He leaned the broom against a wooden pillar. "Every morning, when I sweep," he said, "I am reminding myself yesterday's matters have passed. The words that shouldn't have been said, the thoughts that shouldn't have been thought, the regrets that shouldn't have been carried, they are all dust. I don't sweep to clean the house. I sweep to lighten my heart." You nodded. You suddenly remembered all the dust you had never swept away, a hurtful glance you hadn't dared to forgive, an unfinished dream you kept agonizing over, a promise you hadn't fulfilled to yourself. It was all still there, clinging to you like dust on an altar that hadn't been wiped in ages. The old monk calmly swept a few more strokes. When he was done, he dusted off his hands, sat down beside you, and exhaled very softly. "A long time ago," he said, "I used to think enlightenment was a great, glittering light that would flood the mind. But now I see that perhaps enlightenment is just waking up early, sweeping the house, brewing tea, and letting nothing go to waste." You suddenly remembered the many days you had let slip by, like sand through water, formless, traceless, without feeling. Not because you lacked things to do, but because you lacked presence. He opened a small jar on the shelf. Inside was pink salt. He took a pinch and sprinkled it into the boiling water. "This salt," he said, "is from a mountain in Tibet. A rare time when I left the tea house. I traveled over 12 passes and through 7 villages just to get a small handful." Your eyes widened. "Why go through so much trouble?" "Master, because the person who gave me the salt was a blind girl, but she could distinguish the scent of every type of soil, every gust of wind. When she handed me the salt, she said, 'I don't need to see you, Master. I know you carry peace in the sound of your footsteps.'" You felt a chill run down your spine. The words of a child who had never seen light, could see a person's heart through their footsteps. "I keep this salt not for its taste," he continued, "but because her words taught me when your heart is still. You don't need to be loud for others to feel it." You exhaled very deeply. How many times in your life had you needed to shout, to explain, to prove you were right, only to be left exhausted? Perhaps you had forgotten peace needs no justification. It has its own sound. The old monk poured the salt water into a small cup and pushed it toward you. "Just take one sip. Don't swallow. Let the saltiness dissolve in your mouth, like all the bitter things that have come to you. Then spit it out and feel what you feel afterward." You did as he said. The salty taste soaked in as quickly as a returning memory. The unforgiven things, the things you once considered unjust. But then, when you spit the water into a small ceramic bowl, the saltiness vanished, and in your mouth there was only a gentle warmth, like mist. "Forgiveness," he said, "is not because others deserve it. It's because you deserve to be at peace." You sat still. There was nothing more to add, only the empty cup before you, and a heart that was beginning to fill up again. But this time with an emptiness that held nothing, a full emptiness, light, quiet, and deep. You sat still for a long time, not to prolong anything. You just no longer had a reason to rush. Outside, the sun was spread evenly on the steps, shining through the willow leaves, casting shimmering spots of light on the old wooden floor like ripples on water. Everything in this tea house kept its own rhythm, not fast, not slow. Even the silence had a rhythm, like a wordless song that hummed on and on. The old monk took a long piece of paper and unrolled it before you. It was an ink wash painting, done in brown ink that had aged over time. On the paper was a small boat, drifting on a river that, if you looked closely, had no shore. "I painted this 10 years ago," he said, his hand gently stroking the edge of the paper. People asked, "Why does the boat have no destination?" I just replied, "Because life has no destination." You furrowed your brow, but didn't argue. You just felt something gently break in your heart, like a drop of water shattering on the surface of the moon. We often ask, when will I finally reach a place of peace? When can I finally rest? But the boat, in truth, has been at rest since the moment it surrendered to the current. You were silent. You thought of yourself, of all the times you had fought against the current of life, of the turns you had tried to swim against to hold on to what was no longer there. And you understood that perhaps peace is not in the destination. It lies in ceasing to resist. The old monk continued, "When I was young, I also wanted to find the right thing, a right path, a right person, a right time. But then, that right thing always changed. I grew tired of chasing it, until I sat down and realized there is no eternal right. There is only the observing mind. That is what needs to be seen. You thought of all the choices in your life you had once considered wrong. But now, sitting here, you wondered if it weren't for those wrong things. How could you be present in this peaceful morning?" He rolled up the painting, tied a cloth string around it, and handed it to you. "Keep this," he said, "not to hang, but to remind you, you don't need a destination to float completely." You took the scroll, as gently as if you were taking a piece of a life someone had lived through, so you could learn from it. The old monk stood up and opened a door behind the tea house. Outside was a small garden with a peach tree, a bamboo grove, a few orchid bushes, and a dry well. Sunlight sparkled on the water. The sound of birds chirping felt like they had just discovered the morning. "Shall we take a walk?" he said. You nodded. The path of crushed stone wound around the garden like a spiral. Each step on it made a crunching sound. But instead of being disruptive, the sound made you feel at peace, like a silent walking meditation, where each footstep was a phrase, "I am alive." The old monk stopped by an orchid bush. He bent down and picked up a fallen petal. "Do you see?" he asked, holding up the petal. "Beauty doesn't have to try to exist. It already exists. It's just that we are not always quiet enough to notice." You took the petal from his hand. It wasn't fragrant. It wasn't vibrant, just a pale petal that had left its stem. But strangely, you found it heartbreakingly beautiful. "There are things that can only be seen once they have fallen," he said. The two of you continued to walk around the garden. The bamboo rustled. The wind blew. The familiar sense of dew, earth, and rotting wood enveloped you like a thin cloak. No one said anything more, because everything that needed to be said seemed to be present in the silence between your footsteps. When you returned to the tea house, he poured you one last cup of tea. "This cup," he said, "is to see a guest off, but not to see you out. It's to see you back to yourself." You brought the cup to your lips. The taste of the tea, this time, was both strange and familiar, as if all the previous cups were just introductions. And this was the real story. You closed your eyes. letting the aroma of the tea and the morning sun melt into one another. In that moment, when you opened your eyes, the old monk had stood up and walked over to a wooden shelf where a small drum sat. He struck it 3 times, not loud, not resonant, but enough to make any remaining stray thoughts in your mind fall away. The sound of the drum dissolved into the space like a wisp of smoke that would not return. You bowed your head without saying goodbye, without needing to promise a return, because you knew everything you needed was still here, in the tea, in the breath, in yourself. You sat alone after the old monk had gone inside. The morning light was brighter now, casting a warm golden layer on every wood grain, every line of moss, and even the cracks in the earthen wall. But there was no sense of glare. Everything was as gentle as a thin blanket draped over a soul that had just awakened from a deep sleep. You placed your hand on the last cup of tea you had just finished. The pot was empty. The aroma of the tea was gone, but in your heart was an overflowing fullness that couldn't be named, not happiness, not quite peace, not anything sublime, just a feeling of being enough. You looked around the tea house, now as familiar as a childhood room. None of the objects were special, yet everything was filled with meaning. The peeling wooden shelf, the chipped corner of the tea table, the frayed edge of the bamboo curtain, even the straw broom leaning silently against the pillar. They weren't trying to be beautiful, they just were. And because of that, they were incredibly beautiful. A light breeze slipped through the half-open window, making the wind chime in the corner of the roof tremble. The sound it made was like a call from a very distant place. It was unclear whether it was from the past or from deep within you. You suddenly remembered the days you used to travel so far, so fast, so hastily, just to find a place that made you feel safe. And now, perhaps you had found it. Not a place, but a moment. The very presence of you in the present. The back door creaked open. The old monk returned, holding a small wooden box sealed with silk rope. He placed the box on the table and pushed it toward you. "This tea is for you to take home," he said, "but not to be drunk in a hurry. Every time you feel your heart is troubled, take a pinch, brew it in silence, and remember the atmosphere of this morning." You picked up the box, as light as if you were holding the entire morning sky wrapped in your palm. Remember, he advised, tea has no magic, but the person who brews it, if fully present, will turn every sip into mindfulness. You smiled, your heart letting go of another layer. Then, as if suddenly remembering something, you asked Master, "How many cups of tea did I drink last night?" The old monk sat down, his eyes twinkling, like young leaves catching the first drop of dew. 10, he said. Exactly 10. And you were the last person of the day. You laughed, not out of surprise, but because it felt as if everything had been arranged. Perhaps for a very long time, this 10th cup of tea was always meant for you. You stood up and bowed deeply, a wordless prostration. "Thank you, Master," you said, your voice warmer and steadier than ever before. He nodded. "Thank you for being truly present." You stepped outside. The small stone path was still slightly damp from the night's rain. The sun had risen above the opposite roof, casting its first rays through the green willows. The birds had begun to sing more clearly. The trees bowed slightly, as if bidding farewell to a guest who had just become a part of this place. You turned back to look at the tea house one last time. The wooden door had closed, No sound of it shutting, no goodbye, only the gentle wind and the lingering scent of jasmine in the air, like a promise that didn't need to be kept. In your pocket, the white pebble and the rolled-up ink wash painting rested. You didn't need to open them to remember. Every step you took away from there was already a part of the verse. You didn't know where you would go next, but this time, you no longer needed to search, because you had learned how to stay here. Even while walking away, you left the tea house not with hurried steps, but with a stillness that spread through your every movement. Each step was a gentle echo of the night that had passed. The dirt path leading to the main street was the same, but you were no longer the same person. The willow tree by the road, which you hadn't even noticed last night, now seemed to be waving at you with its soft green branches. Sparrows hopped between the cracks in the bricks, and the light reflecting off the dewdrops looked like tiny, smiling pearls. You walked slower than usual, not because you were tired, but because there was no longer any reason to rush. With every footfall, your heart felt a little lighter. The old nagging questions were gone. The invisible sense of lack was gone. There was only the gentle rhythm of your breath, like tea being poured just right and stopping at the perfect moment. An old woman carrying a basket of vegetables walked past you. She nodded a greeting, and you bowed in return. You had never met, but she didn't feel like a stranger, because your heart was still. Everything felt close. You walked across a stone bridge, over a small canal. Beneath the bridge, the water was so clear you could see your reflection, and you realized this might be the first time you had ever seen yourself in a state of peace that needed no editing. A light breeze blew by. The white pebble in your pocket gently bumped against the carefully rolled ink wash painting. The sound was faint, but it was like a tap on a hidden corner of your heart, a place once filled with old echoes, now resonating with the sound of the present. You stopped at the side of the bridge and sat down, not because your legs were tired, but just to sit. You took out the pebble, placed it in your palm, and rested your hand on your lap. Your eyes closed, not to meditate, not to do anything, just to sit. And you remembered the old monk's words. The mirror reflects nothing if the mind is not still. But once it is still, everything appears as it is. You didn't try to still your mind, but you also did nothing to agitate it. You just let everything be, and in that being, you began to see. You saw an image of yourself, not your face or body, but the worries you had carried, the times you had tried to run from your feelings, and the sleepless nights without knowing why. It all appeared, gently, without judgment, without threat. Then, like clouds dissolving from a mountaintop, all those images vanished. Only you remained present, still and whole. You opened your eyes and saw the sun had fully risen. The light sparkled on the water's surface, like musical notes singing the wordless lyrics of a scripture that needed no writing. You stood up and continued walking. The road no longer seemed as long as before. Or maybe it was because you were no longer afraid of the journey. On the side of the road was a small shop with a few dried peach branches hanging and a bamboo sign with a faded inscription, "Tea, brewed only for those willing to sit a while." You laughed. It was so similar to the place you had just left, and it was also something that made you want to stop again. You pushed the door open. A young woman with her hair tied back was tending to a stove. She turned, a little surprised to see a customer so early, but then she smiled. "Have a seat. I've just boiled the water." You sat down, touching the surface of the table. It was new, It didn't have the marks of time like the old monk's table, but your heart was different now. This time, you hadn't come to fill a void. You had come because you just wanted to sit. The woman brought you the first cup of tea. She said nothing. You brought it to your lips and took a sip. The taste was light, not as fragrant as last night's, but you didn't compare. Because the tea was not wrong. It was just that your heart had changed. You looked outside. A bird was flying past. You didn't ask. Where is it going? You didn't ask. When will it return? You just followed it with your eyes and smiled. Because you had understood. This moment is a nameless cup of tea. It can only be drunk with complete presence. The first cup of tea at the small shop didn't surprise you, nor did it evoke anything particularly special, but it was gentle, like a song you heard as a small child, whose lyrics and melody you can't remember, but which stills your heart for a moment. The young woman didn't talk much. After pouring the tea, she just bowed her head slightly and returned to the stove. There was something in the way she moved, the way she lit the fire, poured the water, and arranged the cups. That reminded you of the old monk from the night before. Though different in age and form, they shared the same spirit, doing everything with presence. You looked around the shop. It wasn't cluttered, just a few wooden tables, a small shelf displaying some loose-leaf tea, and a vase with a blossoming plum branch. But it was this simplicity that made you feel as if you had returned to a place neither new nor old, a place where time stopped to make room for the space inside you to expand. The woman returned with a new pot of tea and poured a second cup. You didn't drink it right away. You looked at her and asked gently, "Where did you learn to brew tea?" She smiled. Not a big smile, nor a shy one. "I didn't learn," she replied. "I just brew it every morning, for myself." Gradually, it became a habit. You nodded. Your heart silently thought perhaps the most beautiful things in life don't come from learning, but from living with them, patiently, gently, without a goal. You lifted the second cup of tea. The taste was warmer, a little richer. Perhaps the water had steeped the leaves more deeply this time. But you knew it could also be that your heart had softened. She sat down opposite you. She didn't ask who you were. She didn't ask where you came from. She just sat with you. In the morning light and the tea, "This tea," she said, "I steeped it last night, under the moon. I heard that tea leaves that absorb the moonlight retain the soul of the night." You were surprised, not by what she said, but because you yourself had just lived through such a night without loss, without expectation, only tea, rain, and the silent heart that knocked on no one's door. You asked softly, "Do you often sit alone and drink tea?" She nodded, "A lot." At first, it felt empty. Later, it felt spacious. You smiled, a smile from within. She asked you in return, "What about you? How many cups have you had?" You looked at the empty cup. You remembered the night before, remembered every story, every nameless lesson. Then you replied, "Exactly 12. She tilted her head and smiled. "Then the 13th cup is on me." You nodded, not because you needed another drink, but because you felt something was continuing to flow, connecting the old night with this new morning. And you wanted to stay, to go with that flow. While waiting for the water to boil, she said, "When I was little, they used to call me the quiet one. My friends said I never talked, but I preferred listening. I found that everything has a voice, if you are willing to be still enough to hear it." You said nothing, but in your heart, the old monk's words echoed, "Don't try. Just leave your ears open, and everything will enter on its own." You told her a little about the tea house, about the old monk, about the rainy night and the steam. She listened in silence, nodding without interrupting. Then she said, "Maybe we once sat with the same person at 2 different times, but the aroma of the tea is still one and the same." Her words moved you, not because of the connection, but because you suddenly understood truth belongs to no one. It spreads through every sip of tea, every breath, every quiet morning like this one. She poured the 13th cup. It wasn't more fragrant, it wasn't more special, but you lifted it with the reverence of someone receiving a new lesson. You drank, then looked at her. Nothing more needed to be said, and she said nothing more. Perhaps a cup of tea can be a beginning. It can also be an end. But most importantly, it is always the moment in between the one where you are present. You don't remember how much time passed after the 13th cup of tea. No one looked at a clock. No one mentioned the time. But the strange thing was, you didn't feel like you had lost anything. In fact, you felt as if you were regaining something you had dropped long ago, a part of you that once knew how to live slowly, deeply, truly, and then forgot in the vortex of daily life. The woman stood up, said nothing, and went to the back of the shop. You didn't ask where she was going, nor did you feel the need to. In that moment, her absence was like the vanished steam, no longer there, but still present. You looked out the window. A peach blossom petal fell onto the tiled floor. It didn't break. It wasn't tattered. It just fell. And then it lay there, still, as if completing a cycle, without sadness, without regret. You bent down, picked up the petal, and placed it in your palm next to the white pebble. Suddenly, you saw a strange connection between the two, a pebble from a distant mountain shaped over millions of years, a petal from the peach branch outside, alive for only a few short days. But they both had one thing in common. They didn't try to hold on to anything. A small sound made you look up. The woman had returned, this time carrying a long, dark brown wooden box with intricate carvings. She placed the box on the table, but didn't open it right away. She looked at you for a moment, as if waiting for confirmation. "Have you ever brewed tea for someone else?" she asked. You were a little flustered. "Never. At least not with a mind like this." She nodded, then opened the box. Inside was a small tea set. Not porcelain, not jade-glazed ceramic, but rough, ash-gray earthenware, flecked with sand. "My father made this set," she said. "He wasn't an artisan, just a man who liked to mold clay after the harvest." You looked down at the tea set. Each piece had its own bumps, its own dents, its own uneven lines. But it was this very rustic quality that made them feel strangely intimate. "He used to say," she continued, "that good tea is not in the pot. It's in the person who pours. And the pourer, if they still desire recognition from others, the tea will never be whole." You exhaled, as if her words had just lifted an invisible layer of expectation from your chest. You realized, perhaps, in all your journeys to so many places, the one thing you still hadn't learned was how to serve with selflessness, to pour without needing praise, to brew without needing anyone to know your name. "You try," she said, then gently suggested, "Brew a pot of tea, but don't brew it for me. Don't brew it for you. Brew it for presence." You didn't hesitate. Your hand trembled slightly at first as you touched the pot, but then every movement became as gentle as the early morning breeze. You took the tea leaves and put them in the pot. You poured the water. You waited. You poured out 3 cups, one in front of her, one in front of you, and one in the center of the table. The middle cup, you said, is for this moment. She didn't reply, just nodded. You both lifted your cups, without clinking, without making a sound. But you knew in your heart that something had just connected without promises, without familiarity. Only a shared presence in a single pot of tea. You drank. The taste of the tea was not distinct, but the feeling was very clear. You were doing nothing other than drinking. Not thinking about before, not thinking about after. Just the taste of the water on your tongue, flowing down your throat, then dissolving into your chest like morning sun on a river's surface. She looked at you, her eyes as soft as tea leaves that had just unfurled in hot water. You are ready to brew tea for others now. You didn't reply, but your heart understood not to teach, nor to prove anything, but to remind someone and yourself that presence is the greatest gift. You took the white pebble and placed it beside the tea set. This, you said, was left to me by my teacher. But now, I think it should stay here. She didn't refuse. She only said, then this place will always have a cup of tea, waiting, and a pebble to hold the stillness for a traveler's heart. You smiled. Nothing more was needed. Outside, the wind once again swept through the willows. The wooden door creaked softly, and you knew no matter where you went, you had brought the tea house with you. The old monk, this woman, and yourself, the lightest, truest, most present version of you. You left the small tea shop not long after, but you carried nothing with you except a light heart. No tea packet, no souvenirs, only the pebble you had left behind, and a pot of tea you had poured for presence itself. The midday sun was now stretching across the small stone path leading into the old town. It wasn't hot, just enough to cast shimmering slivers of light on the edges of the bricks, on the banana leaves, and in the eyes of passers-by. You passed by an old bookstore. The wooden door was slightly ajar, revealing an old man dozing behind the counter, a half-open book still resting in his hand. You saw life there, not the bustling kind, but a quiet life, like a cup of tea left for a long time that still holds warmth at the bottom. You didn't go in, not because you didn't want to, but because you didn't need to search for anything more right now. With every step, you felt as if you were sipping a waterless tea, the tea of awareness, the tea of sufficiency. You turned into a small alley where the sounds of street vendors faded, and the chirping of birds grew closer. The alley led to a wall covered in green moss. On the wall, written in faded brown ink, were the words, "Stillness is not a place, but the ability to stay." You stopped. You read it again and again, not to try to understand, but because each word seemed to be read silently into your very being. No one was there to explain it, but you knew that the words felt as if they had been inside you for a long time. Only now you could hear them. You took out your phone, then put it away. No picture, no saving. You let the words dissolve into you, just as the scent of tea had dissolved into your breath the night before. A middle-aged man walked past you, leading a little girl by the hand. The girl held a small bamboo branch, sweeping the ground lightly as she walked. No dust flew up, but specks of light did. They danced in the sunlight like awakened dust motes of time. The little girl looked at you, smiled, and then said to her father, "Daddy, I can hear the earth breathing." You smiled. The father stroked his daughter's head gently. Yes, because you are quiet. You can hear it. You turned to look at the mossy wall again. You no longer needed to read it. The words had transformed from text into feeling. Stillness isn't found anywhere. It's in how you listen to the earth, the water, the wind, the people, and yourself. You continued walking, not knowing the street name, not caring about the direction, but every turn now felt intentional. Because you were walking with a settled mind, every place you set foot became a place of return. You passed a small lake. The water's surface was so calm, it reflected the clouds in the sky. You looked down and saw your face, not tired, not strained, but whole, like a cup of tea poured by someone who no longer expects anything from the act of brewing. An old man was sitting on a stone bench by the lake, picking up fallen leaves from around his feet. You approached him and nodded a greeting. The old man smiled, said nothing, and then held out a dry, heart-shaped leaf. For you, he said, to remind you that some things fall not because they have withered, but because it is time to return to the earth. You took the leaf, placed it in your palm, and felt something very strange. It was as if your heart had just shed something too, an expectation, a worry, a definition. The old man looked at you with sharp eyes. You've just learned how not to hold on, haven't you? You were surprised. He just chuckled. I used to be someone who couldn't let go, until I realized my hands can only hold one thing, and that should be the present. You nodded deeply, not because his words were clever, but because you had seen them, manifest in every cup of tea you had drunk. You sat down next to him. Neither of you spoke further. The sky was leaning toward afternoon. A gentle breeze blew across the lake, carrying the distant sound of children playing, the tinkling of a wind chime from a nearby porch, and the silent warmth of people who knew how to slow down. You knew you would leave this city, but you were no longer the person you were when you arrived, because now you weren't carrying much except a heart-shaped leaf, an imaginary teapot always ready to be poured, and a single lesson. Stillness is not a destination. It's how you stop and know where you are. The sun had sunk low on the other side of the city. The last light of day stretched into long streaks of orange and gold, casting the shadows of you and the old man on the tiled path around the lake. No one said anything more, and you suddenly realized some of the most beautiful conversations are the ones that require no words. You stood up and bowed deeply. The old man nodded and waved, not asking for your name or contact information, because you both understood the encounter you just had was not meant to be kept, but to be released. You left the lake, walking through streets that were slowly being dyed in the colors of twilight. The stalls were lighting up, the sizzle of cooking, the whispers, the footsteps all wove together into a symphony of daily life that you had never noticed before. Now, every sound was as clear as a bell ringing in your heart. You remembered a line from the old monk piece comes not from separation, but from blending in without dissolving. And now you understood. Peace wasn't about finding a secluded place to hide. It was about being in the middle of a bustling city, with a heart as light as a tea leaf, in water sunk yet not heavy, still yet ever present. You stopped in front of a wall, covered in calligraphy. The brown characters were faded by sun and rain, but still legible. Sit down, fix nothing, just see everything as it is. You felt as if another knot in your heart had just been untied. How many times in your life had you thought, I need to fix myself? I have to be better. I must be stronger. I must understand more. But if you just needed to see clearly, without fixing, without pushing, without pulling, then perhaps you had already stepped through the gateway of meditation. You slowed your pace even more. Each stone under your feet was no longer just a place to step, but a nod of agreement. Just keep walking. It doesn't matter where you're going. Every step is a destination. You turned down a small, random street and realized you had come back near the place where you first arrived in the city, a roadside eatery you had once rushed past. This time, you stopped. The owner was a stout man with a silver beard, flipping cakes on a charcoal grill. You sat down on a small plastic stool and nodded a greeting. "You've come from far away?" he asked, his voice hoarse. You smiled and nodded. "Yes, from very close by." He looked at you, a bit surprised, but then he smiled too, as if he understood what you hadn't said. You ordered a simple meal: rice, stir-fried vegetables, and a glass of warm water. When the food was served, you clasped your hands before eating, not as a ritual, not because anyone was watching, but simply because you wanted to give thanks, not just for the food, but for your own full presence in that moment. You ate slowly, each bite, not eating while thinking, not chewing while replaying the past or imagining the future. Just the taste of the vegetables, the grain of rice, the saltiness of the soy sauce, and the real living experience happening on your tongue. It was the simplest meal you had ever had, but also the most fulfilling. As you were leaving, the owner called out after you, "You look like someone who just found something very important." You turned back, smiled, and replied softly, "I think I just stopped looking." He nodded and laughed heartily. That sentence is more delicious than the whole meal you just had. You laughed with him, not because he was right, but because you felt you had truly understood a deliciousness you had never tasted before. You continued walking. The road was now covered in a soft, dim light. The streetlights had just come on, and the evening hum of cicadas blended with the gentle swoosh of passing cars. You quietly took the dry, heart-shaped leaf from your pocket, looked at it one last time, and then gently let it fly away with the wind. You didn't keep it, not because you didn't treasure it, but because you had learned how to let go, to release without losing. You didn't know where you would be tomorrow, whom you would meet, or what you would do, but you knew this: all you need is a pot of tea, a quiet place, even if it's within your own heart, in a crowded city, and a mind that is no longer wandering, and any place can become a tea house. And you had become someone who knows how to brew tea, not to teach, but to live. As night fell, you found you were no longer lost in the darkness, as you had been on previous days. Perhaps because this time, you weren't walking through the night to find the light, but to walk with the night like an old friend who had returned. Not a stranger, not a threat. You chose to return to the simple lodging by the river, to a small room with an old bamboo bed and a round window. You opened the window, and the night breeze flowed in, carrying the scent of water, of young bamboo, and from a distance, the sound of a drum and gong from a temple chanting its late-night sutras. You sat down, clasped your hands, and recited no prayers, yet your heart was filled with things to be acknowledged, not in words, not to be analyzed, just a silent chain of gratitude. You took out the ink wash painting the old monk had given you, opened it halfway, and then folded it again. You didn't need to hang it up. You just needed to know it was there, like a lesson that didn't need repeating, only to be remembered for having been present. You pulled from your pocket a small piece of paper that the woman at the tea house had left for you as you departed. No well wishes, no name. Just a single line: keep brewing tea, even if no one is sitting with you. You smiled, softly, like someone who has just heard something they have known for a long time, but needed to be reminded of at just the right moment. You opened a pot of water and placed it on the small alcohol stove the innkeeper had left for guests. The flame flickered to life. The water began to sing. In the flickering light, you saw each face again: the old monk, his head tilted under the thatched roof; the young woman with her hair tied back, brewing tea in the morning; the old man by the lake, offering a heart-shaped leaf; the owner of the eatery, laughing with his whole voice. They hadn't gone anywhere. They were all here, in the steam that was beginning to rise from the pot. You brewed tea, alone. Without rushing, you poured 2 cups, one for you, one left empty, not waiting for anyone to arrive, but to remind yourself there is always a place for the present. You took a sip. This time, you didn't try to find the taste, because the taste came naturally, like a friend who shows up unannounced but at just the right time. Outside, the night deepened, but you remained seated, not sleepy, not tired, just sitting, the way the old monk used to sit and pour tea, without words, without reason. You thought about your life, how many things you had once yearned for, and you saw what you had lacked wasn't happiness, but the ability to recognize its presence, like a cup of tea that had grown cold because you were too busy thinking about better pots of tea you didn't have. Now you were present, with this cup of tea, with yourself. The wind by the river blew stronger. You heard the sound of an oar stroking the water somewhere, distant like a lullaby. You listened, not trying to find meaning, just listening. And you realized you don't need a temple, you don't need a bell, you don't need a Dharma talk. All you need is a breath slow enough, a sip of tea full enough, and a heart still enough to become a sanctuary. You drank your cup dry, then raised the empty cup to eye level. This cup, you whispered, is for everything that has passed and for all that is yet to come, which I do not know. You set the cup down. The dim lamp by the bed flickered and went out, but you didn't turn it back on. You lay down, pulled the thin blanket over your chest, your fingers still feeling the residual warmth. And just before you drifted off to sleep, you told yourself, not with words, but with a deep, profound feeling, tomorrow, I will brew tea. Even if no one comes, even if no one knows, I will brew it for myself, for presence, for the tea that once taught me just being here is already enough. You awoke when the sky was still pale. No alarm clock, no one calling, just a single, soft chirp from a bird somewhere, and then silence, as if it had come only to wake you once. The first light of day shone through the round window, casting your shadow on the wooden floor. There was no rush, nothing waiting, but you still sat up, put on your robe, and stepped outside. A new habit born of gratitude. This morning was not cold, nor was it sunny. The air was thick with the scent of the river and damp earth. You walked slowly along the small path by the embankment, where a few elderly people had begun their morning exercises. A few young people were jogging, and an old woman carrying buckets of water hummed a wordless tune as she walked. You walked silently among them, not trying to separate yourself, nor trying to blend in. You were simply a person walking with presence, without a goal, Not to enjoy or to heal, but simply to live. You stopped at a stone bench overlooking the river. You sat down, your hands rested on your lap. Your back wasn't tense, your neck wasn't bowed, your heart wasn't adrift. You just sat. The water's surface rippled, reflecting the pale clouds and the distant temple roof on the other bank. A gentle breeze swept across the river, carrying a few floating leaves. You watched them without thinking. Where they were going didn't matter. They were just floating. You took a small piece of paper from your pocket, the last one you had brought from that tea house. The paper was slightly wrinkled, the ink a bit blurred at the edges, but the words were still clear. When you see that there is nothing worth holding on to, every moment becomes precious. You read it slowly, as if you were writing it yourself. And then, something strange happened. You no longer wanted to keep the piece of paper, not because you didn't treasure it, but because you had finished the cup of tea it represented. You folded it carefully and tucked it under a small stone at the base of a tree next to the bench. Not for anyone to find, not to leave for anyone, simply to let it stay in a place where someone had once carried it so far and had now returned. You stood up and continued walking. Each step now felt as light as if it had never carried any burden. Not because the burden had disappeared, but because you were no longer clinging to it as something to be endured. You passed a small roadside stall, setting up for the day. The young owner was wiping tables and placing fresh yellow chrysanthemums in an earthenware vase. When she saw you, she smiled. "You're up early." You nodded, "Yes. When the tea is brewed in your heart, you don't need boiling water." She laughed, asking no more questions. And you knew that sometimes understanding between people doesn't come from exchanging many words, but from breathing together in an atmosphere that is quiet enough. You returned to your room, took out a clean set of clothes, and packed your bag. Before leaving, you brewed a pot of tea. No one was there to drink with you, but you still poured 2 cups. 1 cup, you took a small sip, then left it. The other cup, you poured onto the ground by the porch, right at the base of a banana tree. "For the earth," you said silently, "and for that which never left." You locked the door, slung your backpack over your shoulder, and walked out of the alley. You didn't look back. There was no need to carry any images with you. Everything was already inside you. At the bus station, you sat next to an old woman holding her sleeping grandchild. The baby was sucking its thumb, breathing evenly. You looked at the baby for a moment, then at the grandmother. She nodded a greeting. "Are you traveling far?" You smiled. "No, not too far, just a little deeper inside." The old woman didn't ask further. She just looked at her grandchild and said softly, as if to herself, "Yes, everyone has to learn how to go inside themselves eventually. Otherwise, it's too tiring." The bus arrived. You got on and chose a seat by the window. As the bus started moving, you saw the stone bridge where you had once stopped, the lake where you had seen your reflection, the mossy wall with the small inscription, and the alley leading to the old tea house. Everything receded into the background. But this time, it was no longer a feeling of leaving behind. It was a feeling of carrying with. You took out the heart-shaped leaf from your pocket, which you thought you had left behind. It turned out you had only left behind your worries, not what was precious. The leaf was still there, pressed flat in your notebook. You smiled and closed your eyes. Not to sleep, just to settle again. One more time, the sound of the bus engine blended with the wind, whistling through the cracks of the window. In that steady hum, you once again heard the sound of water being poured from some invisible teapot right inside your heart. And this time, that cup of tea was for you. Not to understand more, not to be enlightened, just to live and to keep pouring. The bus glided smoothly through country roads shaded by bamboo groves. Outside the window, golden rice paddies swayed in the sun. You sat still, in no rush to reach a destination, because for the first time in your life, you no longer felt the need to arrive anywhere at all. You remembered a whisper from the old monk that night. A wise person doesn't ask for the way, but listens to their own footsteps. And you understood. Your footsteps were the map. Your breath was the guide. And the destination was always beneath each present step. The bus stopped in a small town. A few passengers got off. Some were in a hurry. Others were distracted. But among them, you remained still, like a lake amidst the waves, unattached, unstuck. A young woman got on and sat in the seat next to you. She was carrying a bouquet of lotuses wrapped in newspaper, their gentle fragrance filling the bus. "The lotuses were just picked this morning," she said softly. "I'm taking them to my grandmother." You nodded, asking nothing more. But your heart was moved. You thought of the lotus, a symbol of purity, rising from the mud unstained. You thought perhaps people are the same. We don't need to leave the mud, but simply learn how to blossom within it. The young woman took out an old book with a faded title. You glanced at it and recognized it as a collection of ancient Buddhist stories, an old edition. "Can you read Chinese characters?" she asked, her eyes full of surprise when she saw you looking at the page. "Not many," you replied, "but I once heard them told through tea." She laughed. "Tea can tell stories." "Yes," you said, your gaze fixed on the distance. "It tells them with its scent, its steam, its silence." A moment of silence passed between you. But it wasn't awkward. It was a space just large enough for both of you to breathe, to be present. You took out the cloth-wrapped ink wash painting. You didn't unroll it. You just placed it on your lap, as gently as placing a hand on a story that has already been told. The girl saw it and tilted her head. "Whose painting is that? No one's," you smiled. "It's what someone paints when they don't need to leave a name." She nodded, as if she understood. Some of the most beautiful things are the ones made without anyone knowing who made them. You looked through the window. A flock of birds was flying diagonally across the sky. No formation, no calls, but they were all heading in the same direction, just like how we live. You said it was unclear whether you were speaking to the girl or to yourself. The less we prove, the closer we are to the truth. The bus drove on, passing a crossroads with an ancient banyan tree. Under the tree, an old man was arranging bundles of bamboo brooms. Each of his movements was slow, as if he were weaving into them a joy that needed no witness. You suddenly remembered the broom in the tea house and the story the old monk told about sweeping in the morning, not to clean the dust, but to lighten the heart. The girl next to you leaned her head against the window and began to doze off, her hands still cradling the lotus bouquet. You looked at her and suddenly saw the reflection of so many people you had met on this journey, people who were as quiet as lotuses in the mist, as tea in water, making no sound, no movement, yet always complete. You took out a small piece of paper, torn from the edge of your notebook. You wrote on it in soft script, "If one day your heart feels cold, boil a pot of water, brew a pot of tea, and sit still until there is nothing left to say. You folded it and placed it between the layers of newspaper, wrapping the lotuses, as gently as leaving a wish that expects no reply. The girl didn't know, and you didn't need her to. You just smiled, because you understood teaching doesn't always require words. Sometimes, it's just about leaving a little something behind on a morning, like the scent of a lotus, like the aftertaste of tea following the first sip. The bus kept moving. To what destination? You no longer cared. You told yourself, no matter where I end up tomorrow, no matter if I have to return to the old rhythm of life, a part of me has been rebrewed, like a tea leaf, steeped a second time, no longer with the sharp intensity of the first brew, but with the depth of experience. You touched your chest, where your breath was still warm, and you saw clearly that place was now a tea house. A tea house with no walls, no cups, no steam, only you and the cup of the present. The bus slowed as the sun reached its peak. You opened your eyes after a short nap, dreamless without a jolt, just a temporary pause, enough for your body to rest and your mind to continue settling. The girl next to you had left at some point. On the seat, a single thin lotus petal remained, lying on its side like a rest note. You didn't pick it up, just bowed your head to its absence with gratitude because its presence had been enough. The bus stopped in a small town nestled in the hills. You decided to get off, not following any schedule, no map, no one waiting, but you knew any place is the right place to be. If you arrive with a wakeful mind, this town was small, gentle, and smelled of wood. The sound of a saw cut through the air from a workshop near the station, mingling with the scent of sawdust and dried cinnamon from an herbal medicine shop across the street. You slung on your backpack and walked, not looking for a guest house, but for a place to sit. At the end of the road stood a 2-story wooden house. The front door was slightly ajar, and from within came the sound of a zither, a steady, simple melody, like a memory being plucked, string by string, to dissolve into the wind. You stood on the steps, looking inside. No one came to greet you, but you felt invited, just as tea invites no one, yet is poured for all who quietly enter. You knocked gently. A small, slightly stooped old woman with silver hair and a burlap apron emerged. She didn't ask much, just smiled with her whole face and invited you in with a nod, as if she had known you for a long time. The house smelled of old sunlight and the sound of time. You sat down on a small wooden chair near the window. The old woman went inside and returned with a bronze teapot, so old it shone with the color of nameless afternoons. She poured a cup, placed it before you, and then poured one for herself. She said nothing. You didn't ask. You just lifted the cup and took a sip. The tea was warm, with a light bitterness and a sweet aftertaste. Not too strong, not too weak, just right. Like a meeting that was neither too early nor too late. The old woman looked at you. Where have you been that you look like you've just come home? You smiled. I'm not sure myself, but this time, I wasn't searching. She nodded, took a sip of tea, her gaze distant, as if she were looking through you and seeing something familiar. Long ago, my husband used to teach tea is not for the rushed, because its flavor is not in the swallowing, but in the silence that follows. You closed your eyes, and it was true. After the first sip, the clearest feeling was a settling, a stillness that came not from the outside, but from your own heart, ceasing its frantic beat. You told her about the old monk, about the tea house, about the cups of tea for presents. She didn't interrupt, just nodded gently each time you paused. It seemed she had heard similar stories before, from someone else, or from within herself. When you got to the young woman's words, "Keep brewing tea, even if no one is sitting with you," she suddenly smiled, her eyes slightly moist. "That's right," she said. "I've been brewing for 30 years, for just one person. But he's gone now. I still brew, not waiting for anyone, but to remember that I once knew how to love." You were speechless. The cup of tea before you was no longer just water and leaves. It was a living testament to steadfastness, to a love that needed no reply, and to a belief that if there is still someone who knows how to brew tea with a true heart, a part of this world is not yet broken. The old woman stood up and took out a small oak box. Inside was a packet of tea tied with red thread, accompanied by a letter folded into the shape of a plum blossom. "This," she placed it in your hand, "was the tea my husband left behind. I've kept it for a long time, but I think you should take it with you." You looked at her, your eyes stinging. "May I keep it?" "It's not for keeping," she said. "It's for continuing to pour." You bowed your head, as if bowing to a small mountain that had stood firm through many seasons of wind and rain. Before leaving, you looked back at the wooden house and saw that it was not just a house. It was a verse written in tea, in time, in a wordless and faithful love. You carefully placed the packet of tea in your backpack and walked on. There was no need to know which place was the end, because every place you passed could be a cup of tea, and every cup of tea, if poured with a sincere heart, becomes a door opening toward peace. You left that small town the way a leaf falls onto a lake without a sound, without clinging, yet leaving a ripple that spreads far and wide. In your backpack, the packet of tea weighed only a few ounces, but in your heart, it weighed as much as a silent promise to keep pouring. Not because anyone needs it, but because you need to remind yourself every day of what it means to be present. On the way, you walked more. You stopped longer. You looked closer. Not because you wanted to be slow, but because you no longer needed to be fast. Every road was now wide, because your heart was no longer narrowed by desire. You stopped at a roadside stall where a middle-aged man was brewing tea for himself. You didn't order anything. He looked at you, nodded, and then poured another cup, placing it opposite his own. "It's been a while," he said, "since someone sat down without demanding anything." You smiled and accepted the cup. You didn't thank him with words, but with your eyes, with the way you placed both hands under the cup before lifting it, as you had learned from the first monk in the first tea house. He stared at you for a moment, then spoke, as if to himself, "People keep asking, what's so special about this tea? But no one asks, is my own heart ready to drink it?" You nodded, feeling as if you had just been asked a question you had been waiting to hear for a very long time. The two of you drank in silence. No need to share the past. No need for the future. Just two people, one cup of tea, one moment, and then you knew your journey had come to an end. Not because you were finished, but because you had seen that all roads are just ways of returning. When the bus brought you back to where you had started, the familiar street corner, the old rented room, the trees still shedding their leaves, with the season, you felt nothing of a return, because you had never been gone. You had simply woken up in the middle of a life you had once forgotten. You opened the door to your room. Everything was the same, but because your heart was different. the scene held a new shade of meaning. You wiped the table, washed the pot and cups, and brewed a pot of tea. No one was there with you, but you still poured 2 cups, one for you, one for the silence in your heart, the part that had always been there, waiting for you to stop. On the table, you placed the packet of tea the old woman had given you. You didn't open it right away. You wanted to save it for a truly still morning. Then you picked up a pen, opened your old notebook, and wrote the first line after many days of only listening. Every breath is a sip of tea. Every step is a chant. It doesn't matter where the path is. All that matters is whether I am here. You closed the notebook, you poured the tea, and you sat still. No more searching, no more trying to understand. Because now you knew for certain life is a tea house with no walls. Every day is an invitation. And you, if you are quiet enough, will always find yourself being poured full. Now, as the lights have softened, as all words have silently retreated like smoke dissolving after a final pot of tea, you are sitting still. No need to pour more, no need to stop. You are exactly where you need to be in this moment. Your breath is steady. Your heart beats rhythmically. Your thoughts seem to have gone to sleep earlier than you. No one is calling. No one is pushing. You just need to relax your fingers, release your shoulders, and let your body become an unobstructed stream. You can close your eyes now. If you haven't already, no need to hold your breath. Just breathe as you always breathe naturally, without judgment, without wishing it were better, because everything you need is already here. Whether today is your first day of sitting still or your 1001st, this moment is still new, still pristine, like the first time someone poured you a nameless cup of tea. Let all the noise dissolve like steam. Let your mind settle like tea leaves after they have completed their cycle. If there is something that needs to be forgiven, let the last cup of tea do it for you. If there is someone you haven't had a chance to thank, let the next cup speak for your heart. And if you are the one who needs an embrace, a reminder that you deserve to be in this world, then let this very silence be the deepest whisper. You are already enough. Nothing to add, nothing to fix. Just stay, and tomorrow, if your heart still feels vast and unsettled, brew a pot of tea, then sit still, and let the present pour into you once more. Next story. We begin a slow and silent journey to a small village, hidden in the Indian countryside. The sun has not yet risen. Mist still clings to the blades of grass, and the early birds have not yet woven their full morning song. You stand before a hut thatched with old palm leaves, where a thin wisp of smoke from a clay chimney draws fragile shapes in the air, like thoughts fading from the mind. Inside that hut, a gaunt old man, his hair flecked with silver, sits cross-legged before a potter's wheel. He is a potter, and in his hands is a soft, damp lump of clay, slowly being transformed. Each turn of the wheel is like a breath, steady and sure. And each turn is also a reminder. Everything changes. Every form will eventually dissolve. Every self is but unformed clay, waiting to be understood, then let go. No one remembers exactly where the potter came from. Some say he was once a novice in a mountain monastery, who one day packed his sandals and renounced his saffron robes to come down and make pottery. Others say he was born in this village and has never traveled farther than the riverbank a few miles away. But no matter the story, you feel something in his presence that stills you. Here, there is no noise, no rush, only the warmth of the earth and the rhythm of the wheel, like an endless stream of life. You step closer, your feet pressing into the fine earth, still damp with the night's dew. The potter doesn't look at you, but perhaps he knows you are there. He continues to pat the clay gently, smoothing the lip of the emerging bowl. "Every bowl is a lifetime," he says, his voice low and soft as a breath. "Some are thick-walled, some are fragile, but in the end, all must face the fire. You don't know why, but your heart falls silent. Are you too just a lump of clay being shaped by some unseen hand on the wheel of life? Are all the things you cling to emotions, names, memories, just a thin glaze, easily cracked by the flames?" He pauses for a moment, setting the unfired bowl aside, and then looks at you. "Do you know what keeps the bowl from collapsing?" he asks. You shake your head. It is the balance at its center. If you cannot find the stillness within you, every form you try to create will soon collapse. You exhale softly. Tonight, you are not just hearing a story. You are listening to your own heart, being turned, cleansed, and fired in the kiln of meditation, only to be gently released, like ashes carried on the wind. You remain standing, your feet on the cool earth, your hand unconsciously rising to your chest as if to hold on to the warmth of his lesson. The potter turns back to his wheel, which continues its steady, silent motion, like an endless current of time. The space in the hut is nearly motionless, save for the pale yellow light of an oil lamp dancing gently on the earthen walls, and the smell of damp clay mingling with the scent of embers from the night before. You stoop and sit down across from him. He neither invites nor stops you, as if your presence was accepted from the very beginning. For a moment, you are no longer a listener, but a part of the story, an old student returning, or a wandering soul stopping by to find what it does not yet understand. "Do you know where clay comes from?" he asks, still not looking at you, his gaze fixed on his shaping hands. "From the earth," you reply. He nods slowly. "From the earth, a place that was once the bodies of countless beings, the bodies of roots, the bones of animals, the wings of cicadas. Clay carries the memory of death and life. That is why every bowl has a soul. If the potter knows how to listen, you look at the lump of clay in his hands, which is now taking the shape of a teapot. Its rim is perfect, its body as round as a mother's belly, and its handle curves slightly like an unfinished smile. Not a single line is forced, not a single crack. Everything seems to be born naturally from the intention of his hands. In the village, people often ask him to make pottery for special occasions, offerings, weddings, even funerals, but he never charges a high price. "I don't sell bowls," he once told a stranger. "I only trade them for something born of the right connection." When a poor man came asking for a bowl for his elderly mother, the potter only asked, "Does your mother tell stories?" The man, surprised, nodded. A few days later, the potter gave him the bowl and said, "The next time your mother tells a story, write it down for me. I will listen with my heart, not my ears." You had heard that story from the villagers who told it with admiring eyes. But only now do you understand the meaning behind it. Each piece of pottery is a continuation between people, between the past and the present. Nothing is truly mine. There is only connection and the act of passing it on. A light breeze blows through a crack in the door, carrying the scent of magnolia from a bush near the well. He lifts his head, inhales softly, and then says, "Sometimes we don't need to change the shape of the clay. We just need to sit still and listen to it tell us what it once was. You suddenly remember all the times you tried to change everything: your job, your relationships, even yourself, trying to mold your life into a better shape, a more worthy existence, without ever stopping to listen to yourself, to your roots, just like the clay, which already carries the entire history of all things. In that moment, you touch a very soft truth. That happiness is not found in whether we shape a beautiful bowl. It is in the gentle way our hands touch the clay. He hands you the newly formed teapot. It's not perfect, he says, but it's enough to pour a warm cup of tea if you know how to wait for the water to boil at just the right time. You take it, feeling as though you are holding an entire lesson on impermanence and contentment in your arms. You sit quietly, holding the rough, unfired teapot, the moisture of the clay still clinging to your fingertips. The atmosphere in the hut seems to slow down, not because time has stopped, but because your mind has suddenly become very still. You begin to listen, not only to the potter's words, but to the silence between them, the soft whir of the potter's wheel, the sound of the wind outside, gently touching the leafy walls, and somewhere, like a distant whisper, the echo of your own inner self, slowly awakening. Do you know what keeps the clay from falling apart? He asks, his eyes still on his kneading hands. Water, you reply. He nods. Water allows the scattered particles to connect, to become soft and ready to transform. Just as compassion keeps the human heart from growing hard and dry, you fall silent. Water in the clay, like compassion in a person, something unseen, yet it determines the entire potential for life in the form. People may look the same on the outside, but only with compassion can they truly shape happiness. When the new bowl is finished, he gently places it on a wooden tray, preparing it for tomorrow morning's firing. No one knows where the bowl will crack, he says, but we must still place it in the fire, because without fire, there is no true form. Fire, pain, trials, the very things we often avoid, are what give a form its strength. You suddenly remember the times you thought you couldn't bear it, the breakups, the failures, the long nights filled with tears. But it was after those very times that you felt you had matured a little. You desired less, judged less, and were calm enough to be sitting here, before an unknown potter, listening to the earth tell its story. He stands up and fetches a new bag of clay from the corner of the hut. It is still wet, heavy, and the color of early morning mist. For the clay to become a bowl, you must learn to surrender, he says. Not surrender to life, but surrender to the truth. You cannot control everything. You look at the heavy lump of clay in his hands, feeling as if you are holding a piece of your own past, all the fears, expectations, and things you haven't let go of. Now, you have two choices: hold on tight and grow rigid, or soften. Allow yourself to be shaped, accept the fire, and then the light. The night deepens. The small oil lamp flickers like a breath after a long day. The potter sits down again by his wheel and gently closes his eyes. That's enough for today, he whispers. The clay has told many stories. You gently close your eyes too, feeling as though you are no longer an outsider. You are the clay. You are the fire. You are the hands learning to shape without force. A night bird calls out in the darkness, not as a signal, but simply as a part of the world, like everything else, that is turning with you on the wheel of impermanence. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the leafy walls of the earthen hut. You had long been awake, not because of a rooster's crow or any loud noise, but because of a profound silence, as if the world was breathing more slowly so you could hear yourself clearly. The potter was sitting at the entrance of the hut, holding a small cup of tea, his gaze fixed on the distant point where the sun was gently touching the hilltop. The steam from the tea rose like a thin mist, shrouding his face and making him look more like a painting than a person. You stepped outside and sat beside him without a word. "It's good to wake early," he said, not looking at you. "When the mind is not yet stained by the day's thoughts, it's easier to see our true nature." You nodded. The two of you sat in silence, watching the light slowly spread across the fields, illuminating the thatched roofs and reflecting in the dewdrops still clinging to the tips of the grass. The world felt as if it had been newly formed, as pristine as unshaped clay. After a while, he handed you a small bamboo broom. "Go sweep the yard," he said, his voice as light as the wind. "The earth also needs someone to converse with it in the morning." You took the broom and began to sweep, each stroke slow and deliberate. The dry leaves, the ash from last night's kiln, and a few fallen flower petals were like remnants of yesterday's memories. You swept not to clean, but to look deeply into your every action. You remembered the Buddha's teaching on mindfulness, that even sweeping the yard is a form of meditation, if you are fully present in every movement, and in that moment, you were no longer working. You were joining the earth, the leaves, and the wind in creating a silent rhythm. After the yard was clean, he invited you to the back of the hut, where he kept the bowls that had not yet been taken to market. Each was carefully wrapped in old cloth and placed neatly on a bamboo shelf. He unwrapped them one by one, showing them to you. "I made this one when my mother was still alive," he recounted, his hand as careful as if touching the past. "I made this one when I was too sad to speak, and I made this one during a summer so dry that the clay cracked before I could even shape it." You looked at the small cracks in the pottery, the mottled glaze like memories fading with time. Each bowl was a crystallized moment with its sorrow, its joy, and even the ordinary days when nothing remarkable happened. He took out a bowl of a deep brown color, a spiral carved into its base. "I once gave this bowl to a friend," he said. "He told me it reminded him of the first time he understood impermanence." You held the bowl, turning it in your hands. The spiral seemed to draw you into a circle with no beginning and no end, like life, like the wheel of reincarnation, like the breath in and out, birth and death. "You know," he said slowly, "every bowl teaches us something. If we learn to listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts." You put the bowl down and looked at him as if wanting to ask, "So what should I do?" He only smiled. "You don't need to know what to do. You only need to know what you are doing, and do it with your whole heart." Outside, the kiln was being lit for the new day. You heard the crackle of firewood, smelled the scent of ash carried on the wind, and in your heart, something was smoldering, not an emotion, not excitement, but a vague yet very real understanding. You don't need to be someone else. You just need to be a bowl being shaped with everything you already are. The fire in the kiln grew, its orange-red glow casting flickering light on the earthen floor, making everything inside the hut look like a smoldering dream. You sat nearby, observing the potter as he fed the fire with dry branches he had arranged the day before. His movements were still slow, unhurried, as if he were conversing with the kiln itself, an old friend who knew its breath and heartbeat. "Do you know why we use this kind of wood?" he asked, holding each branch as gently as if it were a bird. You shook your head. "This wood burns evenly. The flame is not too high, and it doesn't die out suddenly. It's like the mind of a practitioner. It shouldn't be too fiery, nor should it grow cold. You must maintain just the right amount of heat, enough to fire, but not to burn." You watched the fire burn steadily, feeling it stir something within you. How many times had you let your emotions flare up and burn everything down? How many times had you extinguished your own genuine desires for fear of getting hurt? And had you ever lived with just the right amount of heat? While you were lost in thought, he had already opened a large jar and taken out several unfired bowls from the day before. Each was carefully placed on a clay tray, ready to be put into the kiln. "This is the most dangerous moment," he said, his voice low. "If you put them in too early, when the kiln isn't hot enough, the clay will crack. If you leave them in too long, the glaze will burn black. You have to listen to the fire and to the clay." You helped him place the bowls inside, one by one. Small sounds filled the air, the gentle clink of pottery, the rush of wind through the kiln's opening, the sizzle of wood as it met moisture. And amidst it all was the steady beat of your own heart, a silence so deep you could hear it clearly. A moment later, you both sat down again, facing the glowing kiln. He said nothing more, just closed his eyes, and you did the same. Two people, one old, one young, one a craftsman, one a student, but in that moment, you were both simply sitting with the fire. In meditation, one is often taught to sit with one's mind, as if sitting with a crying child, without blame, without trying to soothe, just simply being present. And you suddenly understood. The potter wasn't just sitting with a real fire, he was sitting with the fire inside himself. You remembered the last time you flared up at someone, perhaps a colleague or a loved one. At that time, you didn't know how to sit with that fire. You tried to extinguish it, to push it away, to escape it. But a fire, when suppressed, only smolders inside, waiting to erupt even more fiercely. The potter opened his eyes and looked at the kiln. "Now we can only wait," he said. "Just like in life, there are some things you have to let burn naturally. You can't rush them." You nodded, taking a deep breath. Amid the soft cracking of the kiln bricks and the smell of fresh ash, you felt yourself being fired and hardened along with the bowls. No one taught you this. There were no sermons, no theories, just an ordinary morning, a burning fire, and a quiet heart. The sun began to climb toward noon. The light outside shone directly on the thatched roof, making the whole hut glow like a temple without walls. You sat still, your heart no longer desiring anything but to continue sitting here, beside the potter, beside the fire, beside yourself, honest, raw, and silent. You didn't know who you would become, what you would do, or where you would go. But right now, you knew who you were, a student being taught by fire. The afternoon descended slowly, as if the sun itself was lingering to see how the bowls in the kiln had changed color. You and the potter still sat together, but the silence now was not an awkward void, but an invisible bridge connecting two souls, sharing a wordless lesson. A soft crackle echoed from within the kiln. You turned, your eyes filled with worry, but he only smiled faintly. "It's cracking," he said calmly. "But don't worry, because not every crack is a mistake." You were stunned. You had always thought a crack was a sign of damage, of failure. but he saw it as a natural part of the process, perhaps even a necessary one. "Some bowls have to crack to hold their shape in the fire," he continued. "Just like people, sometimes we have to break a little to find out what we truly hold inside." You looked at the blazing kiln and felt as if you were looking into a deep part of your memory. The times you were hurt, the relationships you thought would last forever, but crumbled. The dreams you were so sure of that ultimately left only an echo in your heart. You had considered all those things failures, but now, under the red glow of the embers and beside the old potter, you understood it was those very cracks that gave you the chance to look deeper into yourself, to know what was truly important. You didn't become weaker because you had been in pain. You became more real. He stood up and took an old bowl from a shelf. It was uneven. The glaze was mottled, and down the middle was a crack that had been mended with a shimmering line of metal. "Kintsugi," he said. "The Japanese call it the gold of a wound. They use gold to mend the cracks, not to hide them, but to honor them." You were speechless. A cracked bowl, once thought worthless, now stood as a symbol of rebirth. The crack was no longer a wound, but a testament to the ability to endure and grow. "You don't need to hide your wounds," he said, "for they are where the light can enter." A gentle breeze drifted by, carrying the scent of ash, burnt earth, and something very old, very familiar, like an afternoon from a childhood you had forgotten. You closed your eyes, letting the wind pass through your hair, through your soul, and realized you were breathing in, not just air, but an entire lesson on acceptance. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we will open the kiln." You looked at him, your eyes bright. Opening the kiln, it meant you would see the results of everything that had happened over the past 2 days. But more than that, you knew what you were truly eager to see was not the bowls. It was the transformation smoldering within yourself. "Do you think my first bowl will be cracked?" you asked. He smiled, not answering right away. "Perhaps," he said, "but if it cracks in the right place, you will have a lesson more valuable than a perfect batch of pottery." Dusk fell. The first stars began to appear, as shy as children hesitant to step into the temple courtyard. You looked at the sky, then back at the kiln. Under the flickering light, you suddenly saw yourself also being transformed, like clay fired into earthenware, like ash becoming a piece of memory. Tomorrow, the kiln would be opened, but tonight, you were already beginning to understand how to sit quietly within yourself. You woke earlier than the first rooster's crow. Outside, the sky was still pale, and a white mist veiled the thatched roof and the dirt path leading to the back of the hut. A strange, yet familiar feeling stirred within you, the excitement of a child waiting to open a gift, mixed with the vague apprehension of facing the unknown. You walked quietly across the yard, where the kiln's embers were still warm from the night. The potter was already there, sitting before the large kiln, his hand touching the still warm brick wall, as if listening to the final breath of a night-long chant. He turned as he heard your footsteps. "The sky is calm today," he said, smiling faintly. "The fire has gone to sleep. Now it is time to see the results." You nodded, swallowed softly, and sat down with him before the kiln. He took a small iron rod and carefully pushed away the layer of ash covering the opening. A final wisp of steam escaped, carrying the scent of burnt earth, dry wood, and something deeply contemplative, as if you were opening the door to someone's ancient memory. As he began to take out the bowls one by one, you held your breath. The first one, its rim was slightly uneven, but the glaze was beautiful, a mossy green that rippled like the still water of a lotus pond. The second one, perfect in a strange way, evenly round, solid to the touch, without a single crack. But he only glanced at it, setting it aside as if it had no story to tell. Then came the third. You recognized it immediately. It was the one you had shaped on the first morning, when your hands were still trembling, when you still didn't trust the softness of the clay or the stillness of your own mind. It was cracked, a small diagonal line, as thin as a strand of hair, ran from the lip to near the base. Your heart sank a little. "It's ruined," you murmured. But he showed no regret. He picked up the bowl, turned it gently in his hands, and gave it to you. "What do you see?" You looked closely. The crack was exactly where your hand had accidentally pressed too hard while shaping the rim. And strangely, the crack didn't break the bowl. It was just a fine line, like a wrinkle on a face that had smiled in the wind. "It is not ruined," he said. "It is honest. It tells the story of what you did." You sat in silence, holding the bowl, listening to the truth revealed on its ceramic surface, as if listening to your own confession. It didn't need to be fixed. It didn't need to be hidden. It only needed to be acknowledged. "This is me, with all my clumsiness, but I was fully present when I made this. Do you want to keep this bowl?" he asked, his voice gentle. You nodded without hesitation. "I want to take it with me, as a reminder." He smiled, then continued to take out the other bowls. Each was a world, a small piece of the karmic chain you had just experienced with earth, fire, and yourself. When the kiln was cleared, he washed his hands in a basin of rainwater set outside, then called you over to sit under the magnolia tree. "You know," he said, "that kiln didn't just fire the pottery, it fired you." You bowed your head, realizing his words needed no explanation. You felt it clearly, in every breath, in the way you now held the bowl with gratitude, not expectation. "And in life," he continued, "everything will put you in a kiln like that when you love someone, when you lose something, when you fail. But if you know how to sit still, to let things burn through without panicking, you will be forged into a new form." You sat under the shade of the tree, listening to the rustling leaves, and in your heart, the fire still smoldered. But it was no longer the fire of anxiety, but the fire of transformation, a fire you could take back with you, to live a life, from now on, like clay soft enough to love and hard enough to endure. That evening, you and the potter carried the newly fired bowls to the village well to wash off the remaining dust. The path to the well was covered in dry leaves, and the sound of your footsteps mingled with the calls of evening birds returning to their nests. No one spoke, but the silence wasn't heavy. It was a natural part of the space, like a shadow, walking silently beside the light. The village well stood in the middle of a wide plot of land, surrounded by an old mango tree and a few bamboo groves, dry and songless in this season. The water's surface was clear, reflecting the grey clouds drifting lazily across the sky. You bent down, using a ladle to gently wash each bowl. The fire-hardened clay was now cool and solid to the touch, as if all its intensity had been dissolved, leaving only the firmness of peace. The potter didn't just watch, he knelt and washed alongside you. At one point, your hands touched his over a bowl, but neither of you spoke. The touch was like a silent thank you that you were allowed to be here, at the very moment your life needed it most. Once, he began, his voice as soft as the wind skimming the water's surface. "I made a tall vase for the temple across the river. When I put it in the kiln, it cracked in the middle and broke in two. You listened in silence. I was so angry then," he continued, "all that effort, all that heart. I thought I had failed." He dipped his hand into the well, then lifted a clean bowl, water still beading on its rim. "Later, I took the body of that vase, broke it into smaller pieces, and mixed it with new clay. And from that, I shaped many other bowls." You looked at him, a feeling rising in you that was both poignant and as profound as the distant echo of a temple bell. From the failure of something large, many smaller, more solid things were born, he said. "It's like a person's life. Sometimes the great things that don't work out become the foundation for the simple joys that follow." You thought of yourself. The things you had lost: a job, a love, a belief had once made you feel broken. But because of them, you had learned to live more slowly, more deeply. And today, in this remote village, you had been rebuilt from those very fragments. As you washed the last bowl, you noticed a streak in the glaze that looked like a teardrop running down its side. You showed it to him. He took it, turned it over for a moment, and said, "It's beautiful, isn't it? The tears of the earth." A wordless hymn. You laughed, not because what he said was funny, but because you felt a strange lightness in your heart. Perhaps the streaks, the cracks, the imperfections, they didn't need to be hidden. They just needed to be seen with kinder eyes. The two of you stood up and placed the bowls in a bamboo basket lined with old cloth. The sky began to glow with the colors of sunset. The evening light slanted across the well's surface, making the bowls shine as if gilded with gold. It was a moment so beautiful it took your breath away, leaving you standing in silence for a long time. "Will you be leaving the village tomorrow?" he asked, not looking at you. You nodded. "I have to go back," he said, nothing more. But you knew that in his gentle nod was a complete acceptance, without attachment, without regret. Because in the way, every meeting has its reason, and every parting has its necessary time. As you walked back, the basket of bowls rattled softly with each step, and you realized you were no longer just carrying bowls. You were carrying a new part of yourself, fired by flames, washed by water, and now walking toward a life that was deeper and more gentle. The next morning, mist still hung over the bamboo grove as you packed for your journey. In truth, there wasn't much to pack, just a few simple items: a cloth bag, a bamboo water flask, and the cracked clay bowl you had decided to bring with you as a companion. Before leaving, you returned to the pottery hut one last time. It was just as it had been. The earthen floor still held your footprints, and the potters from washing the bowls the evening before. The wheel sat quietly in a corner, and the ash in the kiln had grown cold. But now, it seemed the space held more than what the eye could see. A part of your soul had stayed here, absorbed into every brick, every crack in the clay walls. The potter was sitting under the magnolia tree, as he did every morning. The sweet scent of blossoms that had fallen during the night lingered around him, mingling with the cool air and filling your heart with a nameless gratitude. You approached and bowed deeply, the way one greets another in a temple, without words, without expression, but full of respect. He looked at you, his gaze calm, yet betraying a quietness like a breeze passing through in its season. "Where will you go first?" he asked. You replied, "I'm not sure, but I think Somewhere there's a person who needs a bowl to listen to." He smiled softly, a smile that carried no expectation, as simple as the morning sun touching a dewdrop. "That is enough," he said. "Carry your heart like clay, soft when it needs to be, firm when it must, and don't forget to return when you crack again." You nodded, though you made no specific promise. The words were etched in your heart as deeply as the glaze on the bottom of a bowl. On the way out of the village, you passed by the old fields where farmers were beginning a new day. They didn't know you, and perhaps never would, but they felt familiar, as if you had once lived their lives, plowed their earth, carried their water, and laughed loudly on a summer afternoon, because in your heart now, everyone was part of the same turning wheel of life. You stopped under a large, ancient tree by the road and took the bowl from your bag. The sun had just risen above the bamboo grove, its light striking the glaze and making the crack glow softly. You touched the crack, feeling no shame or regret. Instead, you felt something like a renewed faith that it is in the cracks where the true light enters, where life quietly finds its way into the human heart. You poured water from the bamboo flask into the bowl. It filled halfway. For a moment, your reflection appeared in the water. The lines were clear, but rippled just enough to remind you nothing is fixed. Nothing needs to be perfect. Simply being present is enough. You sat under the tree, taking a sip of water from the bowl as if you were drinking the essence of all you had just experienced: the earth, the fire, the hands of a man, and the things that cannot be described with words. A group of children ran past, playing and shouting. A little girl stopped when she saw you, curiously looking at the bowl in your hands. You smiled and offered the bowl of water to her. She hesitated, then took it with both hands, as if receiving something sacred. "Did you make this?" she asked. You nodded. "It's beautiful," she whispered, then handed the bowl back, the water still full. You took it, your heart softening with a gentle reminder: true happiness isn't about keeping things for yourself, but about sharing the truest part of your heart, like offering someone a full bowl of water, without calculation, without expecting anything in return. You stood up and continued on your way. The road ahead was still misty, but your heart was clear. You were carrying a cracked bowl, and in that crack, there was a fire that had burned for 3 days, an old potter, a lesson in impermanence, and you who had been lost, had been hurt, had softened, only to become stronger than ever before. You left the pottery village with slow steps, the clay bowl wrapped carefully in a cloth bag at your side like a treasure. The red dirt road led you over low slopes, past sparse bamboo groves, and through fields where the harvest was done, leaving only golden stubble shimmering in the morning sun. You had no map, but you didn't need one. You no longer felt the need for a specific destination. Each step was a returning, a chance to listen to the voice within, like the potter's wheel that keeps spinning, even when no hand is pushing it. At noon, you stopped at a small tea stall by the road. The owner was a mute old man, but his eyes were as bright as someone who had seen many lives. Without being asked, he brought you a cup of lotus tea in an unglazed clay bowl. The fragrance was so subtle, you could only sense it if you were truly still in your heart. When you bowed your head in thanks, he pointed to the crack on the bowl you carried, then nodded with respect. Not a word was spoken, but a conversation more profound than language had just passed between you. "I understand. I have walked that path too." You left the tea stall, with a sudden thought perhaps every broken bowl in the world is silently searching for a hand gentle enough to pick it up, not to fix it, but to cherish it just as it is. As evening approached, you passed a small stream that cut across the path. The water trickled, clear and melodious, like the laughter of a child you once were. You sat down by the bank, took out your bowl, and scooped up some water. The crack in the bowl did not leak. You were surprised. Could it be that through the fire, the clay had been healed enough to hold water, just as a person, after suffering, can still hold on to love? You watched the water reflect the setting sun and took a gentle sip. The taste was simple, nothing special, but you felt your heart being irrigated by something ancient, a remembrance that you were never lacking anything, that you only needed to sit still and look closely at the bowl you were holding. That night, you asked for shelter at a small temple hidden behind a bamboo grove. The abbot, a kind old monk, invited you to drink tea in the meditation hall. As you told him about your journey at the kiln, he just smiled, pouring tea with a steady hand. The earth, he said, is always grateful to those who touch it with a sincere heart, and fire, if treated with mindfulness, will never destroy it, only reveals the true nature. You nodded, silently remembering the moment you first touched the wet clay. So much doubt, so much fear, so much expectation. And then, after just a few days with the old potter, you had learned to let your hands become humble, to listen, and to accept that you were just a part of the endless cycle of earth, water, fire, and time. The abbot invited you to an evening meditation session. Sitting in the small hall under the dim candlelight, you closed your eyes and placed the bowl in front of you. Your breath slowed. Thoughts were like gentle ripples on a lake, and in that silence, you saw yourself not as a name, a past, or a role you carried, but as a vessel learning to hold nothing at all. A cracked bowl, a person who had once been broken, a soul being fired in the kiln of meditation. And in that breath, you saw more clearly than ever you didn't need to become anyone else. Just being here, present like soft clay held by mindful hands, was enough. You woke before the morning chant's wooden block echoed from the meditation hall. The eastern sky was still a dark indigo, and a light wind rustled through the bamboo, carrying the scent of damp leaves and a faint hint of incense from the Buddha hall. You opened your eyes without any sense of hurry. There was nothing to do. Just lie there for a moment. Take a long breath and let your mind flow like a stream. When you stepped into the courtyard, the abbot was already standing there, hands clasped, looking at the sky. He wasn't surprised to see you. There was no greeting, just a gentle nod, and in that nod was a recognition you were different today. Not in the way you walked, but in the look in your eyes. There was no longer any seeking, no more questions, only a deep stillness, like the water in an ancient well. After the morning service, you were invited to help in the kitchen prepare breakfast for the community. There, you met a young novice, about 12 or 13 years old. He was clumsy with the knife, constantly dropping vegetables on the floor, but each time he would just laugh, pick them up, wash them again, without any frustration or sadness. You asked him, "Why don't you get upset when you drop things?" The boy replied, his eyes sparkling like dewdrops. "Master says that vegetables have a heart too. If I drop them and then get angry, I'm getting angry at the vegetables as well." You said nothing. You looked at him as if looking into a clear mirror, reflecting yourself back at you. Perhaps a teacher doesn't always have to be stern. Sometimes, it is the smallest, most innocent beings who teach us how to walk more lightly through life. After a simple breakfast, brown rice porridge, pickled vegetables, and hot tea, you went to the meditation courtyard, where a rock garden was arranged in the shape of flowing water. You sat down, your fingers tracing the rim of the cracked clay bowl. You still carried it with you, not for use, but as a reminder, a small object, yet it contained an entire process. As you sat in silence, an old monk came and sat beside you without a word. After a while, he pointed to the bowl. If one drinks tea from a cracked bowl, does the tea taste different? You shook your head. Then, if our heart has been cracked, does the love we give diminish? You felt a lump form in your throat, not because the question was difficult, but because it was so simple that it struck the deepest part of you. No, you whispered. It might even be deeper. The monk nodded. When we have known pain, we learn how to be gentle with others. You sat there for a long time, until the sunlight filtered through the trees and shone on the bowl in your hands. The crack shimmered strangely, as if it were not a wound, but a guide reminding you that every break is an opening for the light. That afternoon, you bid farewell to the temple, taking with you a little dried tea that the abbot had wrapped himself and a white silk cloth to wrap the bowl. As you passed through the main gate, you looked back one last time. There was no one to see you off. No bell, no novice. Only the bamboo grove rustling in the wind, and your heart, too, was vibrating with a deep, indescribable stillness. You walked on over a long slope where the sky opened up like an ink-wash painting. Every footstep now had its own tone, not a sound, but the sound of presence. You felt that each time your foot touched the earth, your mind was anchored, not drifting, not craving, not rushing. And you knew from now on, your life would not be the same. You no longer needed to search for wholeness, because you had learned that beauty sometimes lies precisely in the cracks. Not in perfection, but not yet needing to be perfect. Not inadequacy, but still in the process of becoming. You continued your journey through peaceful villages, where thatched roof houses nestled beside golden rice paddies, and barefoot children ran on red dirt roads, their laughter ringing like small bells in the afternoon. Everywhere you went, you would stop, rest for a while, drink from a bowl of rainwater, or simply gaze at a wildflower growing by a fence. But the strange thing was, every place you went had a familiar feeling, a sense of peace that seemed to have existed in your heart for a long time. The clay bowl was still with you. Occasionally, you would take it out to drink water or place a few flower petals inside as a way of expressing gratitude for the new day. And each time, you felt as if you were conversing with yourself, a part of you that had gone through fire, endured trials, and slowly matured in the silence. One evening, you stopped in a village by a river, where the people made a living by weaving baskets and rowing boats for travelers. There, you met a middle-aged woman sitting by a charcoal stove, weaving bamboo strips into a basket to sell at the market. When you asked for some water, she filled a bowl, and then looked closely at the one you were holding. "Made by hand?" she asked, her gaze thoughtful. You nodded. "This would be wonderful for brewing lavoie tea," she said, and then smiled. "I used to make pottery too, when I was young." You sat down beside her. The two of you didn't talk much. You helped her weave a few strips, and she showed you how to thread the bamboo without breaking it. The evening sun filtered through the thatched roof, casting a golden light on the bamboo strips, making the entire space feel sacred in a quiet way. As you were preparing to leave, she took out a small packet of leaves. Lanzoa, she said. It helps you sleep, soothes the liver, and eases worry. Brew it with water and drink it from that bowl. Everything will feel lighter. You bowed your head in thanks, holding the packet of leaves in your hand as if receiving an invisible gift from life. As you crossed the bamboo bridge, you looked down at the river below. The water flowed silently, needing nothing more than to continue its course. And you thought, life is like that too. Sometimes you don't need to do anything grand. You just need to keep going, little by little, with a heart that is slowly softening. That night, you found a place to sleep under the eaves of a small, unmanned temple. The head monk had passed away long ago, leaving only a few clay statues and a small vegetable garden that the villagers still tended to occasionally. You built a small fire, brewed the enxoa leaves, and poured the tea into your old bowl. The steam rose, carrying a very gentle aroma, both earthy and faintly sweet, like the smell of the ground after a rain. You sat there, alone, under the crescent moon, holding the warm bowl of tea, your heart not feeling lonely at all. On the contrary, you felt embraced by everything: the sky, the night wind, the distant and near sounds of insects, and the presence of all the people you had met in recent days: the potter, the young novice, the old woman by the stove. They all seemed to be sitting beside you, in this bowl, in that wisp of steam, in every breath. You remembered the potter's words: when you know how to sit still, everything becomes your teacher. And it was true. Tonight, even the sound of the dew falling taught you something: that there is no need to rush toward completion. Just be a bowl in the process of being fired. Just be a heart learning to listen. You closed your eyes, placed the bowl beside you, and rested your head on your cloth bag. No bells, no warm bed, no thick blanket, but you slept very deeply, as if you had returned to the home within yourself, a place where every crack was no longer a weakness, but where the moonlight shone most gently. You awoke to a morning where the fog was as thick as a thin veil covering everything. The sunlight had not yet torn through the pale grey clouds, and the world around you seemed to still be in a dream. The trees were hazy, like an ink painting. The moss-covered temple roof faded under the mist, and each drop of water on the clay bowl beside you reflected the world in a distorted yet poetic way. You sat up, warming your hands over the cold ashes of the fire. The scent of an enxoa leaves still lingered at the bottom of the bowl, making you feel peaceful, as if last night was still whispering in every breath. You gently wiped the bowl with a silk cloth, placed it back in your bag, and stepped out of the temple, continuing on the nameless path toward the hazy sun. Not far along, you came across a man standing by the road, intently fixing the wheel of his ox cart. He saw you and gave a slight nod of greeting. You bowed your head in return. "A traveler from afar?" he asked, his voice hoarse but not without warmth. "Yes, I'm just walking," you replied. "Walking without knowing where you're going." He chuckled, not mockingly, but like someone who was once young speaking to himself. You thought for a moment, then said very softly, "Walking to better understand the path I'm on." He nodded, then pointed to his cart. "I used to walk too. I thought I had to go fast, to be on time, to arrive. It was only much later that I realized arriving doesn't matter. What matters is whether you are truly walking." You stood beside him, helping him fix the crooked wooden axle. While you worked, you said nothing more, but like with the potter, The silence between simple actions became strangely profound. When the cart was fixed, he handed you a small packet wrapped in a dry banana leaf. Sticky rice with mung beans. Eat it later to warm your stomach. You took it, bowing your head in thanks with all sincerity. That afternoon, you found a large tree by a stream to rest. You opened the packet of rice, divided it in two, and instinctively placed one half in your clay bowl. You didn't know why, but the action felt like making an offering not to any god, but to everything you had experienced, learned, and touched with your hands and your heart. As you were eating, a small squirrel approached. It hesitated, then came a little closer, its large, round eyes fixed on a piece of bean in the bowl. You gently tilted the bowl, pushing a small piece toward it. And to your surprise, it wasn't afraid. It didn't run away. It just bowed its head slightly, as if to say, "Thank you," then took the bean and scurried off. You laughed, your heart as light as a cloud drifting over a mountain peak. A simple clay bowl, now a bridge between man and nature, between person and person, between you and the pure part of yourself. That evening, you walked past a barren field full of rocks and dead tree stumps. Not a soul in sight, no bird song, only the wind and a sense of emptiness. But you didn't feel sad. You put your bag down, took out the bowl, and placed it on a large, flat rock. Then you sat down, facing the bowl. It was empty, but you saw it as full of stories, moments, and the people you had met along the way. You no longer needed to fill it with tea, or water, or flowers. Its emptiness was enough to remind you not everything needs to be filled to have value. You meditated right there, in the middle of that barren land, eyes closed, back straight, hands resting palms up on your knees. No guiding sounds, no bells, no chants, just the breath, in and out, just the feel of the cool wind on your cheeks. And you, once again, sat with yourself, no past, no future, just a broken bowl, learning to be present. You don't know how long you sat. When you opened your eyes, the sun was touching the mountaintops, its light slanting across the rocks. The bowl was still there, unmoved, and you, in that moment, knew you had also found your still point in the turning world. No need to become beautiful pottery, no need to avoid the cracks. Just know how to return to your center when the wind blows. And so, you walked on. The next day, as you continued your journey, the path led you to a region of rolling hills, where terraced rice paddies curved like waves against the sky. The morning sun filtered through a thin layer of clouds, dyeing the fields a quiet gold. The people here were harvesting the last crop, and the sound of sickles against dry rice stalks rang out like a familiar chant. You could no longer distinguish whether it came from the people or the land. You stopped by a family who was bundling rice. An old woman with silver hair, her hands, wrinkled but steady, was separating grains from the stalks. When she saw you, she didn't ask anything, just silently handed you a bundle of rice and gestured for you to sit. You understood, without needing words. You sat with them in the middle of the hill, bundling rice, smiling softly, eating rice balls with sesame salt, and none of you felt like strangers. It was as if this life had once been yours, from long ago, in another lifetime, or perhaps just in a dream on a quiet, windy afternoon. After a break, you took out your bowl and scooped some water from a bamboo flask. A small child in the group saw it, touched it curiously, and asked, "Is this yours? Uncle? Auntie?" You nodded. The child turned the bowl around and exclaimed softly, It's cracked. But right after, as if reminded of something deep within, you smiled gently. Yes, it was cracked once, but it still works. And because of that, it can tell a story. The child listened without blinking. Then it whispered, as if to itself, I have a crack too, inside my tummy. But Mummy says, I'm still lovely. You looked at the child and suddenly felt your heart soften like earth after rain. Yes, we all have our cracks, but that is what makes us more human, more loving, more profound. That evening, before parting, the old woman gave you an old conical hat, lined with soft fabric. To keep the sun off, she said. You put it on, feeling as if you were wearing a silent blessing from people you didn't know, but who felt so familiar. You left the rice paddies and entered a low forest, where the sound of birds echoed among tall trees like the pillars of a temple. The smell of decaying leaves, the buzz of late-season cicadas, and the light dancing on the ground evoked a sacred feeling that no cathedral could provide. You rested on a moss-covered rock, took out your bowl, and washed it gently in a cool stream. Watching the water flow over the crack, you were suddenly reminded of all you had been through, from the first time you touched the clay, to the firing in the kiln, to carrying this bowl through so many villages. And you realized the bowl was no longer an object outside of you. It was your heart, once dry, once cracked, once soft, and now slowly becoming a vessel for stillness. You lit a small stick of incense, placed it in a crevice of a rock by the stream, asking for nothing, just a small offering of gratitude for the earth, for the fire, for the water, for the nameless friends who had walked with you, with their eyes, their words, or just a fleeting smile. That night, you slept by a large tree, using your hat as a pillow and your shirt as a blanket. There was no roof over your head, but you felt enveloped by an invisible temple, the temple of the earth and sky, of an inner self that had learned to return. You heard the sound of leaves falling in the night, the chirping of crickets in the grass, and the murmur of the stream like a ceaseless chant. And in those sounds, you understood you were no longer wandering, because wherever there is a quiet breath, that place is home. You gently touched the bowl, placed beside you, like a companion who stays awake in your dreams. It wasn't perfect, but because of that, it was real. You awoke when the sky had not yet fully brightened. Mist veiled everything, and the damp earth was cool like the first breath of day, still lingering from the night. The stream flowed steadily by your ear, and the sounds of forest birds began to echo from afar, one by one, small and clear, like the opening of a meditative symphony for which you were the first audience. You didn't rush. You lay still under the tree, the conical hat under your head, your hand gently touching the bowl beside you. Cold, but not biting. A cold just enough to let you know you were touching something real, not an illusion, not an image. You remembered last night, listening to the stream and the wind rustling through the canopy. You hadn't dreamed, but you felt as if you had entered a very deep dream, a dream without images, only a feeling of pure presence. There was no you, nor was there a bowl, only a complete silence, where nothing needed a name. You sat up, stretched, and went to the stream to wash your face. The cold water made you shiver, but it also awakened your mind. You took the bowl, filled it with cool stream water, and drank it slowly, sip by sip. The water flowed over your mouth, down your throat, into your chest, as if cleansing every last speck of ignorant dust from your mind. You continued on your way, through the low forest where trees grew thickly, their shadows covering the path. Underfoot, the carpet of decaying leaves was thick and soft, like walking on memory. You moved without a sound, like a shadow, like a part of the forest. At noon, you reached a small hamlet by a wide lake, where a few wooden houses stood close together, smoke from their kitchen fires rising lazily. Children played by the lake, their laughter ringing out like bells across the water. You sat down on the bank, took out the bowl to clean it, and then sat gazing at the still, mirror-like surface of the water. An old man approached. He didn't ask who you were or where you came from. He just sat down beside you, holding a bamboo flute. Without a word, he began to play. The sound from the flute rose like the wind whistling through a mountain pass, like water dripping from a high cliff. Each note sent gentle ripples through your mind, as if the past, present, and future were all flowing by in a nameless stream. You sat still, unmoving, letting each note seep into every crevice of your consciousness. When the music stopped, he stood up quietly, nodded, and left. Not a word was spoken, but you felt you had just heard a complete sermon through sound, through silence, through presence. That evening, a family invited you to their home for a meal. They lived simply, with white rice, boiled vegetables, and a soup made from bamboo shoots. You ate slowly, each spoonful of rice like a grain of grace. They watched you, not asking many questions, just smiling occasionally. "What kind of bowl are you carrying?" their young daughter asked. You took it out and placed it on the table. The whole family looked at it. The father said thoughtfully, "It looks like it's not new, but it's strange, as if it has lived through many years." You nodded. "It was cracked once, but it can still hold water, and it can hold a person's heart." He nodded. People are like that too. Some go through many things, think they are broken, but still keep kindness in their hearts. Like this bowl, not smooth, but it has a soul. After the meal, you sat by the wooden window, looking out at the lake, reflecting the newly risen crescent moon. On the table, the bowl sat silently like a friend who doesn't speak, but is always ready to listen. You thought about life, that no one is truly whole. Everyone will eventually be cracked, worn, and chipped, but that's okay, because those cracks are the signs of a life that has been deeply lived. You looked up at the sky. There were no prayers in your heart, only a feeling you were slowly becoming the person you had been searching for, someone who knows how to live with things that are very small, very ordinary, and very real. And the bowl you gently touched the crack always reminded you, beauty is not in perfection. It is in the ability to continue loving, even after being broken. The next morning, as you were bidding farewell to the family by the lake, the little girl was already standing at the threshold, her hands clasped behind her back as if hiding something. When you bowed your head in thanks and said goodbye, she pulled out a small bouquet of wildflowers, a few tiny purple blossoms, their petals as thin as the morning's breath, and gave them to you. With a soft whisper, "Put the flowers in the bowl, Uncle Auntie, so the bowl will have a friend." You couldn't say anything but smile, a lump forming in your throat. You placed the flowers in the bowl, ever so gently. The small blossoms rested quietly in the old vessel, as if they had been there for a long time, waiting to be remembered. And you understood that today, the bowl was not just a tool or a symbol, but a cradle for the most fragile thing of all tenderness. You continued north, where mountains began to rise, peak after peak, their summits glistening with white mist. The path grew higher, colder, and drier, but your heart grew warmer. Each step was a step inward. Near noon, you stopped at a small stall made of bamboo and earth. The owner was an old woman with silver hair and eyes as deep as a well, but as bright as embers. She asked you nothing, only invited you in and offered a hot cup of forest leaf tea. When she saw the bowl you placed on the table, she was silent for a long time. Then she sighed. "I used to have a bowl like this, but I broke it, and I was angry at myself for years because of it." You looked at her. You didn't press, you didn't console, you just listened. "Thinking back now, I wasn't angry because the bowl broke," she continued. "I was angry because I hadn't had time to learn everything it wanted to teach me." You nodded, gently pushing your bowl toward her with a smile. "You can drink your tea from this one, if you like." She took the bowl, her hands trembling as if lifting a memory. Pouring her tea into it, she smelled the aroma of the leaves, then took a sip. Her eyes closed, and in that moment, no one said a word, but you knew she had just been healed. Not by the bowl, but by what she had allowed herself to touch again, a part of the past she thought was lost. You left the bamboo stall as the sun began to cast a dry, warm light. The path led you across a small stream that wound between two mountainsides. You stopped, took off your shoes, and stepped barefoot into the water. Each stone rolling under the stream was piercingly cold, but it didn't bother you. On the contrary, you felt as if you were walking on the silent teachings of the earth and sky. You took out the bowl, filled it with stream water, and floated the bouquet of wildflowers inside. The petals spun gently in the water, like they were dancing in a tiny universe. You sat on the bank, thinking of nothing, doing nothing, just breathing, and silently observing the bowl, the flowers, and yourself also drifting, like the water. In the evening, you met a group of young novices walking from a monastery in the valley up to the highlands to distribute medicine. They wore brown robes and carried large cloth bags on their backs, but their faces were bright, and their laughter was as light as clouds. They invited you to share their dinner: plain porridge, boiled roots, and sesame salt water. A mischievous novice asked you, "Are you a monk, Uncle Auntie?" You shook your head. "No, I'm just walking to understand myself." The novice nodded as if he understood perfectly. It's like when we distribute medicine. It's not to cure anyone, but to find out if we still have compassion for people. The group burst into laughter. You laughed too, your heart strangely warm. In the flickering firelight, you took out your bowl and ladled some porridge for a younger novice. He took it with both hands, then tilted his head. "This bowl has a crack, but the porridge doesn't leak out. That's amazing," you said softly. "It's like people, they've been cracked, but they still hold on to love." The boy nodded and then ate with gusto. That night, you slept in the forest with the young novices. The moon rose high above the mountain peak, its light filtering through the leaves, illuminating your sleeping face. Beside you lay the bowl, as quiet as if it were sleeping with you. It said nothing, but you felt it. It understood you, and you understood it. You two, one person, one object, had both been broken, and because of that, you had both learned how to hold on to what is most precious. The next morning, you awoke to the sound of insects and the smell of embers still smoldering from the campfire. The young novices were already awake. sitting in meditation, facing the rising sun. An unspoken agreement seemed to hush the entire forest, making space for their peaceful breaths. You sat up, took the bowl from your bag, feeling the lingering warmth of the earth and your hands still holding the warmth from yesterday's encounters. You sat with them, not needing to be a practitioner, not needing to chant, just needing to breathe. You let the bowl rest in your lap like a closed flower. In the dawn light, the crack on the bowl caught a glint of light, like a wound that once bled but was now a scar, still flushed with the color of life. After a short meditation, you parted ways with the novices, each continuing on their own journey. A small novice ran after you and pressed a young bamboo shoot into your hand. For you to put in the bowl, Uncle Auntie, when it withers, you'll know you've traveled far. You didn't ask further. You just took the bamboo shoot, placed it in the bowl, and walked on. Even knowing the shoot would eventually wither, you felt a smile bloom in your heart for what in this world is permanent. And if you understood that, you would see that even decay is a form of beauty. You turned onto a path leading up a bare hill. The sky began to cloud over, and the wind blew stronger, making the scarf around your neck flutter. The bowl in your hand vibrated gently, and you heard a sound as thin as a wind chime, the sound of presence. At the top of the hill was a small shrine, with only a cracked, moss-covered clay statue of the Buddha. You stepped inside, lit a small stick of incense, and sat down. You asked for nothing. You prayed for nothing. You just sat. A strong gust of wind blew over and knocked the bowl down. You quickly picked it up. It wasn't broken, but the crack had widened, just a little. You sighed, then smiled. That's fine too. You thought to yourself, it lets more light in. You took the bamboo shoot out of the bowl and placed it beside the Buddha statue. The shoot trembled in the wind, like a small, silent prayer. You stayed at the shrine until a light rain began to fall. You found shelter beside a large rock and lit a small fire with dry leaves to warm yourself. The rain fell steadily, and you watched each drop roll over the crack in the bowl gently, patiently, without demand. It was like the lesson you were living. Everything will pass, whether quickly or slowly. You scooped rainwater into the bowl and drank it sip by sip. The rainwater tasted cold, but it was very clean, very real, and you realized the more cracks the bowl had, the more easily the rain could flow through, the more easily it could be cleansed. Just like your heart, the more it had been hurt, the softer, more empathetic, and more loving it became. That night, you found no shelter. You slept under the stars, your head on your backpack, cradling the bowl in your hands. The wind played with your hair, and the leaves rustled like storytellers, and you, though lying in the vast wilderness, felt your heart was fuller than ever before. You whispered softly, as if talking to the friend beside you. Tomorrow, we'll walk again, not to get anywhere, but because we are living. The bowl, as if understanding, lay still in your hands, no longer heavy, no longer afraid of breaking, because it had already broken and it had survived, and most importantly, it had become the place where you put the most precious things: silence, rainwater, wildflowers, the gazes of strangers, and the small belief that a heart that has been cracked can still continue to hold what is gentle. The next morning, you awoke when the sun was not yet strong enough to dispel the thick mist covering the grassy hill. The clay bowl lay beside you, nestled among dewdrops from the night. and you gently touched it, as a habit, a small ritual reminding you that you were still alive, still present in this world. You sat up, wrapped a thin scarf around your shoulders, and warmed your hands in the first sunlight peeking over the mountain range. Everything around you was silent, but it was not an empty silence. It was a deep, soft, expansive space, as if the universe were holding its breath to listen to you. After drinking the last of the rainwater from the night before, you packed your things and continued your journey. The path beneath your feet narrowed, then disappeared into a rocky valley. You followed the calls of birds and the feeling in your heart, needing no map or destination. Each step was a silent prayer, each breath a message to life. I am here. You arrived at a small village nestled in the shadow of a mountain. Simple wooden houses stood with wisps of smoke rising from their hearths, and the sound of rice pounding echoed from afar. An old man sat mending a net under a large banyan tree in the yard, his eyes as deep as an ancient well. When you approached, he looked at you and pointed to an old wooden stool beside him. Sit. A distant guest must sit before speaking. You sat down, placing the bowl in your lap. He looked at the bowl, then said slowly, "It looks like it has been through fire and tears." You weren't surprised. Perhaps you had grown used to strangers, understanding you more deeply than anyone you knew. "Did you know," he continued, "this village was once famous for its pottery, but then a long drought came, and the fire in the kilns was not strong enough to harden the clay. Generations abandoned the craft, abandoned the earth. You listened, an image forming in your mind of stained hands, cold kilns, and unfinished bowls, never to take form, not because the artisans were unskilled, but because the right conditions were no longer there. Some kept a final bowl," he said, gesturing to yours, "not to use, but to remember, so that when their children and grandchildren asked, they could say, 'This is what we once lived with, what we once believed in.'" You held the bowl tighter. You understood. You truly understood. Some objects, like some memories, don't exist to serve or be used. They exist to remind us that once we lived with our whole hearts, with our own two hands. After sitting with him for the afternoon, you were invited into his home for water and a meal. On the table, they brought out an old bowl, its glaze mottled, with a large crack near the rim, but they still used it to serve rice as usual. "It's okay," the old woman said, "because this bowl can hold a lot of love." You nodded, saying nothing. You just ate each spoonful of rice, feeling as if you were consuming life itself. Simple, rough, but deeply warm. When you left the village the next day, the old man walked you to the edge of the forest. Before you parted, he gave you a small, smooth pebble, the size of your fingertip. "Place this in the bowl," he said, "to give it a center of gravity. Just like a person, you must have something small, something still, to keep your heart from tilting when the wind blows." You took the pebble and placed it at the bottom of the bowl. Instantly, you felt a change, not in the bowl, but within you, as if a stone of stillness had just been placed in your own heart. You walked into the forest, the bowl in your hand carrying a pebble, a withered wild flower, and a crack that had not grown wider. But now, you no longer saw it as a fragile object. You saw it as an old friend, one who had been with you through sun and rain, through change and silence. You thought, perhaps I am also a bowl of life that has been through fire, through the hands of others, that has held tears and nameless moments. And when you knew that, You began to cherish every moment, no longer asking for anything more, just keeping your balance. The path through the forest led you to a wide clearing, where the trees thinned out and sunlight began to filter through the canopy more clearly. You stood silently for a moment under an old starfruit tree, then stepped slowly into the light ahead. It felt as if you had just emerged from a long dream, where every leaf, every bird call, every footstep had a meditative weight. And now, the light at the edge of the forest was like another beginning, clearer, more direct, and also more raw. You set down your bag and took out the bowl. Inside it now was the pebble from the old man, the wildflower withered to a delicate shape, and the old crack, now bright under the sun like a line of fate. You turned the bowl gently in your hands, feeling every rough patch on the clay, every imperfect curve, and understood this is you, not an image of you, not an idea of you, but you, right here. You sat down on a nearby flat rock, placed the bowl before you, and closed your eyes. There were no specific thoughts in your mind, only a question that echoed from far away: if I am nothing, what is left of me? The question didn't need an answer, and you didn't try to answer it. You just sat there, letting it resonate, then dissolve in the wind like a dry leaf falling onto a lake. After a while, you opened your eyes. Before you stood a young woman, simply dressed, a bamboo basket on her arm, standing as silently as if she had been there for a long time. You weren't startled. No one spoke. Then she bowed her head in greeting, and you nodded in return. "Where have you come from, Uncle, Auntie?" she asked, her voice as clear as stream water. "Perhaps from the place where I was cracked," you said, weighing each word. She smiled, sat down beside you, and took a handful of sesame salt and a sticky rice ball from her basket. There was no invitation, but you understood and ate with her. Two people, two bowls, two halves of a life intersecting at just the right moment, not to bind, but simply to be present. When you finished eating, the woman took a small, carefully folded piece of paper from her basket. Unfolding it revealed a line of text written in soft, slanted brown ink. A crack is where the wind can pass through to cool the heart. You looked at the words for a long time. You asked nothing more, because you knew if you were to write one sentence for your life right now, that would be it. You left the clearing as evening fell, the sunlight like honey pouring down from the sparse trees in the distance. You walked without direction, without a goal. The bowl in your hand was still full, not with material things, but with every silent moment you had saved from the people who had touched your journey. You crossed a small wooden bridge over a creek. The water flowed gently, not fast, not slow, just enough for you to hear its trickling sound mingle with the breeze like an invisible chant. On the railing was a piece of rotted wood, hollowed out inside, but the sunlight shining through it gave it a unique beauty, a beauty that only things that have been worn away can radiate. You placed your bowl on the bridge next to the piece of wood. They lay side by side, imperfect, not whole, but beautiful in their own ways. One had been fired in a kiln, the other gnawed by time, and both had not refused life. You sat there until it was completely dark, then slowly picked up the bowl, wiped it clean with your sleeve, and continued walking. You carried nothing new, but you felt as if you had been given one more thing. Acceptance, not acceptance in order to give up, but to understand it is all a part of living. As night fell, you found a large tree to rest under. You took out the bowl, placed it before you, and needed no candle, no chant, no one beside you. You sat there, with the bowl, with the night, with yourself. And for the first time in your life, you felt you needed nothing more. You awoke again under a sky of faded stars, before the east had even begun to glow with the promise of a new day. The crescent moon had just set behind the mountains. There was nothing left but the cool breath of the earth, the sparse chirping of insects, and a silence as thick as an invisible blanket covering everything. You didn't open your eyes right away. You just lay there, your hand gently touching the earth, feeling the life murmuring beneath it. The bowl was beside you, tilted against a root protruding from the ground. You picked it up, examining it closely in the dim pre-dawn light. The pebble was still there. The flower had withered into a delicate, faded drawing. The crack hadn't widened, despite the rain, the campfires, and the mountain forests. Something in you realized perhaps it was your gentle touch with life that had kept the bowl from shattering. You began your descent from the mountain. The path this time was not strange, but not familiar either. You had walked so many trails, yet no place was ever the same. Because with every step, your heart was already different. At a small fork in the road, you paused. Not out of hesitation, but because you felt you were no longer compelled to choose a path. Any path was the way back. If you carried a listening heart, you chose the path to the right, through a sparse bamboo grove. Light filtered through the leaves, falling on your shoulders like streaks of light on a lake at twilight. A withered leaf fell onto your sleeve. You picked it up and placed it in the bowl, adding another fragment of time to your silent treasure. At the end of the path was an old temple with no resident monk. The old wooden gate was ajar, as if it had been waiting for you for a long time. You stepped into the courtyard, where moss-covered bricks paved the way, and a wind chime hanging from the temple eaves chimed softly as you passed. You sat on the temple steps, your back against a wooden pillar, the bowl resting on your knees. Its contents were still the same: a pebble, a withered leaf, a crack, a little silent light falling in. But you felt as if you were holding an entire lifetime. The moments of meditation in the forest, the gazes of fellow travelers, the soft breaths in the night, it was all here. You bowed your head slightly and placed the bowl on the brick floor. Not to abandon it, but to leave it in safekeeping. The bowl had traveled with you far enough. Now it needed to be still, to rest in a place where time was no longer something to be counted. You closed your eyes. The wind brushed through your hair. The early morning chill touched the back of your neck. And in your heart, there was nothing but a deep warmth, like the earth, like tea, like the first light filtering through the leaves. After a moment, you stood up. You didn't look back. You didn't take a picture. You didn't say goodbye, because you knew the bowl was there, and you had left a part of yourself there with it. You continued down the slope behind the temple, not fast, not slow. A woman walked toward you, wearing a conical hat, carrying a basket full of wild vegetables. She looked at you, didn't speak, but smiled, as if she had known you in a past life. You smiled back. In that moment, you no longer needed the bowl in your hands, because you were the bowl. You were the vessel for what is fragile, what has been cracked, what is drying into a beautiful scar. You were the place where water can collect, where light can enter, where someone, in a chance encounter, might place a handful of flowers, a pebble, or simply a look of understanding. You walked on, your heart very light, Everything you needed to carry, you were already carrying, and there was nothing left to hold. Only footsteps and breath, only life continuing. Now, close your eyes. Don't open them just yet. Just breathe. Very gently. Feel the air around you begin to settle, like the surface of a lake after a pebble has dropped. The ripples dissolving into stillness inside you. All movement also begins to slow. Your heartbeat is no longer rushed, your breath no longer heavy. Only a gentle feeling envelops you, like a thin blanket wrapped around you on a misty evening. You are still there, on the mountain path, where the clouds meet, where the cracked clay bowl rests silently under the old wooden eaves, and where every step you once took has left a little piece on the earth. What you have just heard, it wasn't exactly a story, it wasn't exactly a teaching. It was a space for you to sit down, to breathe out, and to remember you do not have to be perfect to be worthy of living. You do not have to be whole to love and be loved. A cracked bowl can still hold water. A heart that has been broken can still hold compassion. And you, after everything, can still keep walking, keep giving, and keep returning, even after being tired, after making mistakes, after feeling pain. If there are still unsettled things in your heart, let them rest here, gently. No need for explanations, no need for right or wrong. Just place them in your own bowl, even in your imagination. Then let them sit quietly within you, like ashes after a fire, no longer burning, no longer hot, just the very real remainder of what has passed. Outside, the wind still blows past your home. Farther away, the night still embraces the whole world. The trees still stand silently in the darkness, and even the things you cannot control are slowly becoming gentler. You don't need to understand everything. You only need to know you, right here, are present, and right now, you are doing the kindest thing you can do for yourself. You are letting go. Just a little is enough. Then a little more. Then one more breath, and everything will slowly settle. Now, if you feel still enough, lie down. Don't think about tomorrow. Don't think about the past. All questions can be set aside. You are in a warm bowl made of earth, of silence, of all the softest things in your heart. Sleep well. We will meet again.